wonderful to hear that. I'm encouraged and honored to be part of what is already happening here. This is my first time to come to Missouri. My daughter was here a couple years ago. She worked at a summer camp. She was a baker. She would send me all these pictures of racks of bread that she made every day, which didn't make it enticing to me to think of coming here. But anyway, it's about time for me to be here, and I can understand, just looking around at the scenery, why people want to live here. But anyway, I also want to just preface my remarks by saying that although a lot of research has gone into what I'm going to talk about today, this is profoundly personal for me. It's my journey. It goes back a long time into my story. I've been shaken by what I've learned. I've been rescued by it. I've been rebuked by it, and it's changed my life. So I'm, talking to you from that vantage point. This means a lot to me. I am amazed at God's heart for his daughters and for his sons, and I think we've missed out on an awful lot. But anyway, I'm a pastor's daughter. I grew up in the church. I was raised on the Bible. I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. I am deeply indebted for that background. Grew up in a family with 3 brothers, and learned very early on that the rules were very different for me than it was for them. The options for them in terms of what they could do with their lives were wide open. And they would talk about the things they wanted to do. One wanted to be a doctor and did become a doctor. One ended up as a pastor. Another one ended up being a vice president at Lockheed Martin. So big futures that they had ahead of them. But for me, the roadmap was very simple. That I would go to college, and I would meet someone, and I would get married after I graduated. And maybe I would work while he finished his education. And then I would become a mother, that I would find my true and highest fulfillment as a woman through marriage and motherhood. So when I graduated from college, and there wasn't anyone I wanted to marry, and I didn't have a very good backup plan, it was like the bottom dropped out. And I watched my brothers move forward with their stories, and I watched my friends move forward, and I felt like my life was going nowhere. And it was for 10 years that went on. So it wasn't just, a few months until somebody wonderful came along. It was 10 years, and when I look back on that, I wouldn't want to go through that kind of a struggle, because it became a real deep struggle with God. It was sort of like, I thought I was following you. I bought into what I thought was my purpose as a woman from your vantage point, and where are you? And I'm left here with, not knowing, not having a story, because I was supposed to build my life around someone else's story. And when I look back on all of that, I thank God that happened to me, because it made me ask questions I never would have asked otherwise. I would be talking in a very different way this morning than I'm going to talk because of that. So the question that I wrestled with was, what is God's purpose for his daughters? And is it something I can miss? Or can I lose it? Or can I ruin it? Or can someone cheat me on it? I started looking at other women's stories. I don't know that I would have noticed that their lives were not playing out according to this roadmap that I've been given in the church. There were women whose husbands died, who were divorced, who were in difficult situations, a lot of single women who were doing other things with their lives, and some of them loved what they were doing. I saw women who had health problems and, were incapacitated, or whose husband was incapacitated, or who never had children, or who had children, but some of them were really struggling, and it wasn't just this perfect roadmap. And I realized I couldn't just ask questions for myself, that I couldn't trust answers that would collapse under other women's stories. And so the parameters of my search got bigger. And then I came to an understanding that when I read the Bible, I'm reading a global book. It's not an American book, it's a global book. And that I couldn't just ask questions for a middle-class American group of women, that I had to ask bigger questions. 21st century for women is a world of extremes. We have women who live in powerlessness. They're not able to show their faces in public. If they go out in public, they have to have a male escort, even if it is a little boy. And then we have women of enormous power, who are heads of states and CEOs and ambassadors to the United Nations and philanthropists that have amazing resources. And I wanted to know if God's message for his daughters was big enough for all of us, that if it included the powerlessness and the powerful. And then I picked up a book called Half the Sky, written by Nicholas Kristof and Cheryl Wooden. That's why I named my book Half the Church. They did research. It's a husband and wife team. Kristof, some of you may have heard of him, he writes for the New York Times. They researched what is happening to women and girls in the world. They talked about sex trafficking and child marriages and femicide and preference for sons over daughters, honor killings, female genital mutilation, rape as a weapon of war. I was devastated by what I was reading. And it's not just happening out there, it's happening in our own world. And I knew that what I was asking had to include them. Is God's calling on his daughters big enough for all of them, for all of us? And will it hold up under the losses and the atrocities and the disappointments and the changes that come to us in this fallen world? It drove me to the Bible for answers. What is God's vision for his daughters? Is it big enough for all of us? Does it include all of us from that first little gasp of oxygen to the last breath? Will it hold up under all the contingencies in a fallen world? My search took me to the narrative of creation, Genesis 1 and 2. It's the only part of the Bible that we have before the fall. And this is where God is vision casting for his world. I'm already losing track of my slides. This is where we find God's vision for his sons and his daughters in his world. And I went into this with certain ground rules. And the first ground rule was that I was looking for universal answers. I didn't want to leave out any woman or girl in any circumstance, in any part of the world. I wanted to include all of us in this conversation as best I could. I didn't want to make jokes. When we talk about the creation of male and female, we make jokes about men, and we make jokes about women. And God is dead serious about what he's saying. And I wanted to pay attention to what God is saying. I mean, this is such a familiar text that we just sort of breeze through it.
I would like, if you are the pastor of one of our local churches, a pastor on staff, raise your hand. Who are our pastors in the room? Yes, awesome. We got a couple of church planters here as well. So glad to have you guys. What about if you are a staff member at one of our local churches? Raise your hand. Got a couple of those as well. This is also, you can look around so you can see who you know and also who you might want to get to know at our breaks a little bit later. Okay, what about, I know we've got a lot of campus ministries, I think, represented here. So if you're from a campus ministry, raise your hand, or at least a couple. College ministry, that works too. Barack is here. All right, we've got some Campus Crusade folks here. Okay, what about our nonprofits? I know we have some nonprofits represented. Excellent. Bunch of you guys. And then I know there is a group of students. So, yay, over here. All right. So my last question is, what about, do we have any theologians or aspiring theologians in the room? Oh God, I was going to say, you are here at a workshop hosted by the Theological Education Initiative to hear a guest scholar speak, and so I think that's what we all have in common. We can raise our hand and say we are all aspiring theologians in some capacity. So that's what we all have in common. So really glad that you guys are here. I just want to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about who we are, the groups that are hosting you this morning. First of all, titles don't necessarily matter, but for practical purposes, I have the opportunity to serve on the board of the Theological Education Initiative, and their staff is here as well. And so you're going to get to hear from Rod Casey right after lunch and hear a little bit more about what TEI is all about if you're not familiar with who they are. So that will be coming. As well as I am the founder of Creative Female. And so for some of you guys, if you saw that on the invitation, you're probably like, what is that? Because it's something you may not have heard of. And so I just thought I would mention it and just tell you the story, kind of a really short story about how we ended up here today and partnering with TEI to bring Carolyn to Columbia. So really, Creative Female started as kind of just a passion of mine that has come out of my personal ministry here in Columbia. So briefly, I got into ministry in a really funny way. I applied to a blind ad in the newspaper for a church secretary at one of our local churches when I was in college. And I had no idea. Literally I remember thinking this, I grew up in the church, surely I could be a church secretary. I'm like, it can't be that hard, right? I've got some, I can type, I can do some other things. I had no idea what God had planned when I said yes to that. And so I had the opportunity to serve in a lot of different capacities, mostly in administrative ministry at that particular church for a long time. But as I kind of started growing, I felt like God tugging on my heart in a lot of different ways about doing something different, at that time I didn't necessarily know how to explain it, other than to say there was just some pastoral stirrings in my spirit that I felt like I could not ignore. And so as I started working through that process, I started reading a lot, just opening my thoughts and my minds to different perspectives, studying scripture, and just started learning and growing. This was probably 2008, 2009. And as I started doing that, I just realized that a passion also stirring in me that I need to be able to share that with others and mentor others, and really developed and kind of clarified this passion to just help women discover who they are in God's kingdom, and also to help discover who they are in God's kingdom and mobilize them for ministry. And so Creative Female was birthed out of that, and it started with just a series of retreats and book clubs and just events as we could have them. And over the course of about 5 years, probably, I had the opportunity to really give and speak into about the lives of 60 women or so who are just doing amazing things all over the city and really around the country now as they've moved along. And so that's kind of the origins, we'll say. And then I had some things change and shift in my life that I wasn't exactly expecting, and had to kind of put a pause button on Creative Female and just hold it before God with what He might want to do with it next, and just kind of wait. And meanwhile, while I was kind of doing my own thing, there was a group of people still out there praying that, and knowing, believing that God had something for Creative Female to do. And so we ended up, thanks to Bill back here from TEI, who hosted a simulcast for us 2 years ago for a conference entitled She Leads. And there were just about 8 or 10 of us, I think, gathered in the TEI room over here when we got to hear Carolyn speak for the first time. And some had been familiar with her book, others of us hadn't. But there was something about her message that really captured us. And the way that she talks about it, and the unity that she brings into the discussion, and just the passion and the vision that God has given her for what God is doing and can do in the lives of our people and in the lives of our churches. And so we kind of knew when we left that conference, we just had this feeling that that Carolyn needed to come to Missouri. But we didn't do anything about it. We knew it wasn't time for a while until about a year ago. And Kristen and I, this is Kristen over here, and Miriam, Kristen and I were having coffee at Panera, and as we were leaving, we just had this sense that it's next year. Like, no, the job is now, the time is now, and you guys need to get to work on this because Carolyn needs to come to Columbia in 2018. So we were like, okay, we'll work on that. And kind of just a funny story, turned around, and Miriam happened to be having lunch and working at a booth in Panera as well. But we didn't know she was there. And so I stopped and had a chat with her, and then called Marilyn not too long after that. And we were like, this has got some movement behind it. And so we proceeded to get a hold of Carolyn earlier this year and start the process of her coming. So that is kind of who we are. There's not much to say other than that, because what God does with this conversation and what God does with Creative Female is what He will do after we are done this weekend. So we will see what that is. I'm sorry. Okay. So just to kind of sum this all up. So I feel like I am here today, and our Creative Female team is here today because God gave us an assignment, or He gave us an opportunity to join Him in something that we believe He's already been doing. Conversations that He's already been starting, and work that He's already been doing in the hearts of you and others that couldn't make it today. And so we wanted to be faithful to that assignment, to that opportunity, and say yes to what He was asking us to do. Carolyn is here today because God has given her a message, and she has committed to be faithful to speak that message when God opens the doors, wherever and whenever He's asked her to speak it. And so we are blessed to have this be a place for her to do that. And you are here today because I think for one reason or another, it's possible a friend or someone who you can elbow right now drug you here. So we will admit that. You might be drunk protest. And that's good enough. That's fine. But I believe that God is drawing you here as well. And that even if that drawing comes with feelings of frustration, maybe about this issue, maybe it's confusion about just the issue of women and things that are happening in our culture right now. Maybe you're angry, I don't know. Maybe you're desperate and you just are looking for God to give you some answers. Or maybe you're here because you're hopeful and you've learned and you're growing and you want to share as well. But whatever the reason is, I believe that God has brought you here this morning. And so we are going to see what God does among us together today. So I am going to
Of what it means to be male or female, what it means to be human, begins here. Every other text of Scripture must be subjected to the scrutiny of the vision that God casts for us in the beginning. And in this vision, God is making 3 powerful statements about His daughters and His sons. The The opening line in my book is that sometimes when you're searching for answers, you get a lot more than you bargained for. The first thing that we learn about ourselves in Genesis 1 is the most important thing you can ever know about yourself. God is preparing to create human beings, and he says, let us make human beings in our image, in our likeness. So God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. This isn't a matter of taxonomy. God isn't just classifying human beings and saying, you're a higher life form, you're not a plant, and you're not an animal. When you read systematic theologies, which some of you, I assume, are doing, theologians will give us a laundry list of qualities that we observe in God that we can also observe in human beings. The capacity for love and mercy and justice, the creativity and artistic abilities we see among human beings, that there is reason and morality, wisdom, that we are spiritual beings, that we are capable of relationships. And all of these things that they list invest every human being with value and dignity and purpose and a fundamental equality, but it barely scratches the surface of what God is giving us. This designation that you are God's image bearer cements in you the highest possible identity, meaning, and purpose. You are ranked at the highest conceivable level for any creature on earth. Every other way we define ourselves, by our gender, our race, our nationality, our social class, our marital status, our career, all of those details about us are secondary to this. This invests each one of us with a calling and a mission from birth. We are called to care for God's creation. We are called to explore and steward and utilize its resources. He spreads the whole earth before his male and female image bearers. We are created to look outward over the created world, not horizontally toward one another. We are told in the Bible that the heavens declare the glory of God. The heavens tell us what he is like. But the place that God wants to see the clearest image of himself, bringing back to heaven, is in us. What happens in God's world becomes our business. Being God's image bearer comes with enormous responsibilities. We have become participants in divine revelation. God's reputation is on the line in how we live as male and female. Our words, our actions, our interactions with others carry enormous weight. Nothing about us is incidental. And it puts a relationship with God at the center of who we are. You cannot know who you are or how you are to live in God's world or what kind of a person you are to be if you do not know the God who created. The word lost takes on an entirely different meaning when you look at it like that. And the number one job that each of us is commissioned to fulfill as human beings is to know the God who created us. You are created to be theologians. That's our fundamental calling in life. Being God's image bearer is also a universal call to leadership. It's leadership that is not grounded in gender, but in the imago Dei. It is an other-centered kingdom brand of leadership. It works for the flourishing of the whole earth and of each other. It is driven by the love of God and the love of neighbor. When I was first learning about this, I wanted to know, what do I do? How do I go about doing this? What would help me become stronger as God's image bearer? And I found help from Hollywood. Actors are image bearers. Helen Mirren was given the role of portraying Queen Elizabeth II. She's an amazingly gifted actress, and she's British. She grew up watching the Queen, but she said when she got the part, it was never going to be enough. She said, I had to make the Queen my study. She did everything she could possibly think of, and she never got an invitation to go sit down with the Queen. She had to watch videos, she had to watch news reports, she had to read books, she had to meet with people who knew her, and she said, everything I saw about her, I practiced. She said, I practiced how she held her head, how she carried herself, what her gestures were, when she put her glasses on, when she took them off, how she held her handbag. She said, had the inflections in her voice. She said the only thing she couldn't get was how the Queen walked. And she said she practiced and she practiced and she practiced, and she was out in her front garden talking with a neighbor. And she said she was pacing back and forth, and she said it finally came. She won the Oscar for her performance. And we are called to aspire to win an Oscar for how we image the God who created us, to reflect Him. I think that's all we need, frankly, but there's more. The second thing we learned about male and female in the first chapter of Genesis is that when God looked at His male and female image bearers, it says He blessed them. And He spread the entire creation in front of them, and He commissioned them to be fruitful and increase in number, to fill the earth and subdue it. They were created and commissioned to rule and subdue all creation, and to do it together. God is launching the most ambitious enterprise that is imaginable. And the team that He brings together to do the job is male and female. In the church, we are stuck debating rules and limitations on women, God's image bearers. Men don't do this, women don't do that. Who's in and who's out, who matters and who doesn't. But according to this, no human being can be spared. I call this the blessed alliance. That God created His male and female image bearers to be an alliance for His purposes in the world. The blessed alliance is the spiritual equivalent of a nuclear weapon. Only the blessed alliance is not destructive, it's constructive, and it's powerful. In fact, it's the best thing that could ever happen to a human being. And it's only good news to anyone in any culture, in any location on the planet that feels its effect. And it's wonderfully countercultural in every single culture. It requires the best we all have to offer. It shouts the good news of Jesus' gospel wherever it shows up. And it matters deeply to God. It's His vision for us in the beginning. And it was Jesus' prayer for us at the end. And it's not just, wouldn't it be nice if men and women could get along better and work in a little bit kinder way together. This boils down to a kingdom strategy. It isn't a club you're waiting to join, it's your birthright to belong in this alliance. You can refuse it, you can ignore it, you can oppose it, you can violate it, or you can embrace it. But whatever you do is part of a greater goal. You choose to add strength and resources, or to weaken the alliance that God designed. So we are God's image bearers, entrusted with enormous responsibility, enormous honor, and enormous privilege in God's world. And we are called to join forces as male and female to do the job that God has given us to do. But the third thing is in chapter 2. Chapter 1 is very focused on the vertical, our relationship with God and His commissioning of human beings. But chapter 2 zooms in on the creation of male and female. And God looks at the man after He creates him, and He says, "It is not good for the man to be alone. I will make a helper," it's the Hebrew word Ezer. "I will make a helper suitable," the word connecto, for him. This is where the jokes start. But God isn't fixing the man. The man was created at the climax of God's creative activity. He is a masterpiece. He's just finished naming the animals. That is the beginning of science. So God isn't saying there's something wrong with man. The other thing that's not happening here is that God is not talking about marriage. There are no parameters to the statements that God is making. He doesn't say it's not good for the man to be alone when he decides he wants to raise a family. There are no parameters. It's a blanket statement. It's not good for the man to be alone, and God is saying this is what he needs. So God is teaching us that men and women need each other. This is a blessed alliance close-up that we're getting. There's a comment about marriage at the very end of the chapter where there's a reference to marriage, and it's actually a very strong anti-patriarchal statement. That for this cause a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. In patriarchy, a wife becomes the property of her husband's family. Really comes under their thumb. So already we have an undoing of the way the world works, culturally speaking. Okay, so when scholars look at something like this, like the word Ezer, which is usually translated helper, what they do is they do an inventory on the word, and they look to see how many times it's used in the Old Testament. And they found out that the word Ezer is used 21 times as a noun in the Old Testament. Twice it's used in Genesis for the woman when God creates her. 3 times it's used for nations that Israel is appealing to for military aid when they are under assault from an enemy. And the remaining 16 times it's used for God as the Ezer, or helper, of His people. Well, when they found that out, they decided that we better upgrade her. So she was upgraded to strong helper. But then the debate that is taking place in the church continued, and they wanted to know, well, what do we mean by strong? And how strong is she? And one side said, she's as strong as she wants to be. And the other side said, she's strong, but it doesn't change her rank with respect to the enemy. And that's where it was when I picked it up. And I went and looked up all of those verses. And I discovered a pattern emerging that in every single one of those verses, the word Ezer appeared in a military context. Israel saying to the nations, send your armies. When I looked up the text that had to do with God, I read that he is our shield and defense. He's better than chariots and horses. He stands sentry watch over his people. And every single one of those verses had that kind of language around it. Well, then I went back to Genesis 1 and 2, which we call paradise, right? The Garden of Eden. But there's an enemy getting ready to attack. What would you call that? Not exactly a safe place, right? And God has commanded the man to guard the garden. It's the same language that's used to describe the angel guarding the garden with the sword after they're evicted. And they are told that they are called to rule and subdue, which implies that they're going to encounter adversity and opposition to their efforts. This is all before the fall. And I concluded from that the Ezer is a warrior. I'm not saying that God created his daughters to be militant or aggressive in negative ways, but that he created her to join the battle with the man, to be a strength at his side, to be a strength for him, to watch his back, to get in his way when he goes down a wrong path. That God is saying she's indispensable. It's not good for the man to be alone. The word konegdo means she's his match. It's like face to face. She stands with him. She's not his inferior. She's not his dependent. She doesn't need his protection. Sometimes he needs her protection. Hebrew scholar Robert Alter writes of Ezer konegdo that it connotes active intervention on behalf of someone, especially in military contexts, as often in the Psalms. It is a call to the life of faith and the mission that God has entrusted to humanity. Every girl child born in the world is an Ezer. I have 2 grand Ezers, but I won't digress. Ezering is how God's daughters uniquely image him. She is created to be a warrior who joins the man in ruling and subduing all creation. She is called to bring her full self, her full strength, her full resources, her intellect, her wisdom, her experiences, her expertise to the mission that God entrusts to his image bearers. To give you some sense of how strongly I feel about this.
Yes.
As I think I'm not mistaken that Missouri is still available. But it's interesting to note that the first team that God calls together is male and female. That the history of men and women working together is older than men working with men and women working with women. It's a kingdom strategy, as I said, and I can't explain why it is so powerful, but it is powerful when it really works. When we come together, when we feel the strength of the others for the mission that God has called us to, and when they feel our strength. When we are a true team, when we are true partners, that's when God's image shines brightest in the world. It's when we serve him together. I liken this to load-bearing walls. If you've ever had anything to do with renovations, or you watch those home renovations on television, or you've been involved in construction of any kind, you know that when you start knocking down walls, before you do that, you need to find out which ones are the load-bearing walls. Because if you knock down a load-bearing wall, you're going to get the roof right down on your head. And I believe that God launched his kingdom to stand on two load-bearing walls. The first load-bearing wall is the relationship between the Creator and his male and female image bearers. Again, I'll say it. We can't know who we are or how we are to live in God's world if we don't know the God who created us. And we're going to be living lies about him because we're just winging it. We need to make him our study. There's nothing more important than that. When you open the Bible, instead of looking for that comforting morsel for the day, we need to be looking for, what does this tell me about God? What matters to him? What does he love? How can I begin to see the world through his eyes? So that's the first load-bearing wall. Utterly vital. It is our oxygen supply. But the other load-bearing wall is the relationship between his male and female image bearers. Again, it's not just, wouldn't it be nice if we added a chair at the table for a woman, but it's that we need to work together. That's how God designed us. And when we work separately and we don't interact with one another and we don't depend on one another, we're working at a disadvantage and we're misrepresenting what God means for us to reflect in the world. And it's from this strong center, a relationship with God and a relationship with one another, that we move out to do the work he's called us to do in the world. When he says be fruitful and multiply, yes, that's about families and reproducing, but it's also about reproducing image bearers of the living God. It is a call to the gospel. It's a call to all of us. And, to live fruitful lives, to use the gifts and the opportunities and the privileges that God has given us. Think what he has given us in this country. To use those to the fullest that we possibly can. To do it for his glory. It also means that the enemy's first attack was beyond brilliant. It was the Creator's 9/11 when both load-bearing walls came down. With one blow, he did that. God's image bearers are cut off from their Creator, and they are divided from each other. And that is the history of the world, and that is what is reflected in the church. That we are divided from one another, that we are afraid of one another, that we are nervous about working together, that we have all of these do's and don'ts about, instead of seeing that we're brothers and sisters that are called to a mission that is bigger than all of us put together. And it is what Jesus came to restore. He came to rebuild both load-bearing walls. The relationship between God's image bearers and their Creator. He is the link that restores us. But he also came to restore us to one another. To break down the barriers that stand between us. Jesus prayed, may they be brought to complete unity. To let the world know that you have sent me and have loved them even as you have loved me. And when that happens among us, the world will know that Jesus has come, that his kingdom is not of this world. People are supposed to walk into our Christian communities and say, what is going on here? These are people who value one another. These are people who are calling each other out to give their all to whatever it is God has gifted them to do, whether it's in ministry or the workplace or volunteering somewhere in the home or the community, that we are calling each other out, not asking each other to hold back. So I want to end with 3 questions. When do we take up this calling? I believe that every time a little girl is born in this world, the doctor or the midwife should say, it's an Ezer. There are places in this world where when a little girl is born, they have to persuade the mother to pick her up. And there's a terrible silence that falls over the family because she's not a boy. And there are places in the world where being born a girl is a death sentence. So I'm not just talking about, should we add a woman to this committee? The kinds of things that we're tinkering over are terribly costly in other places. And, go look at the exhibit and talk to Helen and listen to what she's involved in. They're the consequences of not understanding this, of treating women and girls as though they're unnecessary or that they are commodities to be consumed, is such a violation of the beautiful vision that God had in mind for his sons and for his daughters. So it begins when we begin. As I said earlier, it's a birthright. And when does it expire? When does it expire? God never retires his Ezers. He never retires his image bearers. When my father died, I could tell my mother, she was in her late 80s. This is not the end of you. It's just a different chapter. She's on hospice now. But even in her declining condition, where she can do nothing, God is working through my mother to draw out of other people ministries they would never get otherwise. She still has a purpose. God's purpose is big enough for all of his daughters. And to every breath we breathe, it's full of purpose. It's full of meaning and value. And it's big enough for all of us. No woman or girl is ever left behind. And how far does it reach? This vision frames all of our stories. It invests all of our lives with meaning and purpose. No matter who we are, no matter what season we are in, no matter what we see when we look in the rearview mirror, and some people see some pretty terrible, horrific things. No matter how our stories are playing out, no matter what job God assigns to us, our identity, meaning, and purpose are secure, no matter what falls apart or changes. And wherever we are, every moment of our lives, we are on a kingdom front line. There's no part of your life that doesn't matter. There's nothing about you that's insignificant. You represent Almighty God, and you are entrusted with His mission. Isn't this great? I'm telling you, he asked me if I wanted to sit down. I can't sit down and talk like this. It means we have responsibility for how we represent God in this world. that we are called to know him, to speak and act on his behalf. It means we have heavy responsibility for how we relate to one another as brothers and sisters, how we value one another, how we stand strong in the battle against the enemy. And it means that we are all called, that what happens in God's world is our business, and we are called to rise up for his kingdom. So, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Stay close.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna let that sit for just a second. Is there anybody that feels like they want to share what they felt hearing her talk about that? Inspired. Okay. Empowered. Calm.
Waking up.
Waking up.
A steward.
A steward.
Opportunity.
Opportunity. A gift.
Humble. Hope.
Hope. Thank you, Andrea. Hope. Yes.
God is big enough. God is big enough.
We've got the answer.
Right.
Well, we're going to give you in just a few minutes a time to really, like we said, just engage with God personally about what he might be doing in your heart and in your soul. But I want to give you guys, anybody that has maybe a lingering question that they would like to ask Carolyn before we have that quiet time, if there's something that you would like clarity on, or just want to be sensitive to anything you might need. Yes.
I had a question about how you feel with the value of children. I know in a lot of other countries they'll do, when a woman gets pregnant, they want to do the ultrasound to find out the gender of the child and then make a decision about whether they want to keep it or not. But it seems like in the United States we don't care what the gender is. And a lot of the people in the younger generations, it doesn't matter if it's a boy or a girl, we don't want either. As opposed to, at least in the other culture, if it's a boy, there's an excitement about it. But in the United States, we treat them equally. It doesn't matter what the gender is. We don't want the child. And so I was wondering, I mean, sometimes we kind of play it off as in America we love children, but it seems like at the same time, if you ask most people, you know, if you found out you were pregnant today, how excited would you be? Most of them go, oh boy, that would be horrible. And you also have a very, very negative view on children as a whole. And I was just wondering how you feel that kind of balances. Are we in a better spot in the United States where we treat children are viewed both equally as they're not a blessing, and then in a different country they might culturally, at least the boy is viewed as a blessing, the daughter is not viewed as a blessing. I mean, is that, so where do you see the balance between that?
Do other churches feel like we have?
I don't think that in America we view them as equal. Like most of the people I talk about, they're like, well, I hope it's a boy. You know, like I feel like that's 90% of the people I talk to are other males. So I mean, that's the only thing I would add to it. I'd love to hear your perspective globally though, but I don't actually feel like, I feel like it's more aggressively viewed in other countries as far as they want to take life or remove life. But in some ways, in my opinion, it sometimes feels a little bit equal in preference. But maybe in the perfect world that we should be in, it should be equal.
I'm an obstetrician who does ultrasounds all day long. 10 times a day I will announce the gender of a child. And I don't find that any of my patients have a gender preference unless they already have 3 of one gender. Sometimes they have 4 or 5 of one gender. And I do see people break down and cry when they don't get that gender-breaking child. But otherwise, I do not see a preference for gender.
Well, I have to say this. I have two older brothers, and when I was born, my mother said, "It's a miracle." And she didn't say that about them. So, I'm not sure. I mean, from what I've seen, it's sort of exciting no matter what it is, no matter which it is. Yeah, I think, we're talking about cultures like the culture that's the biblical backdrop to the Bible, where the birth of a son is essential for the survival of the family. And the son is he's gonna, build. I met a man from Tanzania, and I asked him, I said, what was it like to be the firstborn in your family? It was incredible. We were all, a bunch of us were out to lunch, and he just rose up, and I'm thinking, whoa, what is this? And he just said, I am my father's confidant. My siblings all look to me for leadership. I will build my father's estate, his name, and he went on and on and on. So it was like, he said, all my siblings, they follow me. And you see that in the Bible, a lot of the tensions in the family are because, they can't give birth, but they're not asking God for daughters, they want sons. And I think what we have in our culture is, a more egalitarian culture where they have these gender reveal parties now where they're screaming no matter what it is. Yeah, so yes.
It is good to be so aware, though, because we are an international country. I work very strongly with our life-affirming movements, 40 Days for Life and the Sidewalk Advocate in front of our abortion center here in Columbia. And I have counseled with Asian women who have come because they're here for now, for school, for different purposes, and are going to be going back home, and especially those who are into China. It was a very significant issue for them that they were not having a male son, a male child. And that was a major part of their consideration for abortion. So as we minister and work with people and are a voice and meeting needs of the entire community around us, we do need to be made aware.
Well, and this is where I think this vision gives us, foundation for why, how we would talk to somebody like that. I mean, and it's, like I said, it's all through the Bible. If you're Hannah and you can't get pregnant, he's getting another wife to do that job, and it happens all the time. And I asked this Tanzanian friend, I said, what happens if a man is married to a woman who can't give birth or only has daughters? And he said she's in trouble. So it's very real. It's very interesting that you encountered that. I'm not surprised.
I was wondering if you might be willing to share, it's lingering for me in the sense that I was wondering if you'd share, unless you did so when I had to step out, related to your own educational barriers, particularly tension with your father and also in your alma mater, our shared alma mater. Because I loved hearing the story that you told on the video.
Yeah. No, I was in the first class of women at Dallas Seminary. If I had been the fourth son, I would have gone straight to seminary after college, but they weren't accepting women. When anybody would ask my father what seminary he recommended, he'd always say, "Are there two?" So that was the only choice. And when they opened their doors to women, I went. They always say the first class of women is they're not going to create any problems. They're just happy to be there, and that's kind of the way there were 5 of us were. But yeah, it was interesting because my father would never. I never considered ordination or anything like that. I just thought, I want to learn, and I'll teach a Sunday school class or something. But I never had any aspirations for that because of how I was raised. And, but my father would never have, he would have been terribly grieved if I had headed down that path. And never would have agreed to the ordination of women in churches where he was. But there were women in his church who pastored. And one of them, when my dad was going through a really difficult situation in his ministry, there was an older woman who came to our church who was a missionary, and she had been, she was a widow, and she was in her 80s. She was not in good health, and she looked like work when she got there. But she was, my father said, she knew the ways of God, and she noticed that he was going through a rough time, and he said, she got under the burden and she passed her pastor. So, it's not something you can escape. When I went to seminary, I think you were wanting me to tell that that we were not allowed to go during the school year. We had to go in the summers. They didn't want us taking the place of one of the men. But we had men in our class, and they were incredible to us. They treated us like their sisters, and they said, "We're all going out to dinner. Why don't you come?" And they were pastors who had never been able to go to seminary. So it was, from that vantage point, it was a good experience. There were a few little things that happened outside of that circle, but it was really a privilege to be able to go. There was somebody else, or yes.
Hi, thank you for everything this morning. And I will lead with by saying in the process of grieving around the world, all the losses that the world has suffered as a result of the oppression of women. In that grief process, I'm in anger, so just give me grace, please, as I speak. But that's still where I'm at. That's where I'm at right now. I noticed what happened, and I just want to ask you, is this a thing? Is this what we're talking about? But just what happened this morning, where a man spoke up with a question that politically, at least, I'm not talking morally, biblically, but politically at least, is about a woman's right to choose. And then before you could answer, another man spoke up with another point, and before you could answer again, another man spoke up. And I just noticed that. And I'd like for us to notice that together. And that means something to me. And it's hard to bring tension into a room, but I think that tension is already here. And I'm sitting in it. And I just want to share that and then ask you your perspective on that as well.
So you want to hear from me if that bothered me?
Or if you've noticed, or is it just a product of where I'm at in my own process? Or is this something that
men are speaking and women weren't, or what they were talking
you were asked a question?
Oh, and that they
before
didn't
you
wait.
could
But
answer.
I did ask.
Okay.
What did it?
Okay. I did not hear that.
Yeah, no, that didn't
Okay.
offend me. But I can understand, that would might bother somebody. But it didn't bother me. I actually asked for that.
I do want to say, I have 3 daughters, and I gave birth to all 3 of them. And after the first daughter, I can't tell you how many people said, "Oh, you go and get a boy." After the second daughter, "Oh, you need a boy." After the third daughter, "Well, you all go on down to Texas and get you a boy." And so you're not going to see that in the delivery room or when you do an ultrasound. People are going to be excited, but I'll tell you, when you're out there, everybody assumes you want it.
But if
Well,
you
we
had
had the
three,
same, I was gonna say, we had 3 boys. And it was the same, everyone assumed, oh, so you really want to grow them? We'd love to have another boy, we'd be totally happy, so I think it can go both ways.
Yeah.
No, it may be that it's
Too much of one thing, right? Yeah, it is funny how people talk, but it, like I said, it's worse in other places in the world where it's like, yeah, you would be a disaster. You know, seriously. So would I.
We're going to take a pause for now. We'll have several other times to answer questions with Carolyn. And just want to say, again, thank you for, we're hoping to provide a safe place. So, embrace where each other is. So we're actually, like I said, I'm going to turn on a little bit of music. And there's a reflection exercise in your packet. That's the very first one. And this is going to give you a chance.
You're in the back here. Well, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there we go. And you can address it, Carolyn. You may address this, Carolyn, but I was going to ask Carolyn a question. Are you, in your Blessed Alliance chapter, you talk about particularly Mary and Joseph and Esther and Mordecai as examples of the Blessed Alliance. Were you going to address either of those today? A better one. I was particularly struck by Mary and Joseph, and I wanted you to speak to that, because looking at those stories through the lens of the Blessed Alliance was pretty impactful to me, and I didn't want them to miss that. So, if you can address that at some point, we'd love that. Yeah, well, I didn't get to ask you the last one. I didn't want to get too far.
I have a nephew who, when he was born, had a vision problem. And it took a while for them to find out that there was something wrong. And I love the story of when they brought the little glasses and put them on him. He was sitting there sucking his pacifier, and when they put the glasses on him, he dropped his pacifier. And I don't use a pacifier, but I can relate to that because, you know, for a long time, we've been looking at the stories of women in the Bible through the wrong end of the telescope. And their stories have gotten small. And I'll never forget the day someone turned the telescope around for me. And I don't think he knew he was doing it. It was Bruce Waltke. I don't know if you've heard of Bruce Waltke. He's a wonderful Hebrew scholar, and he opens the Bible and he says what he sees. And he was teaching a class at the seminary where my husband was at the time, and his specialty is the poetic books. But they had asked him to teach some of the history narratives, and so he said he was like a kid in a candy shop, but he started talking about what scholars were saying about the ancient book of Ruth. And when he got to that book, I just thought, I know this one backwards and forwards. There's not anything new I'm going to learn here, and that's when I dropped my pacifier, so to speak. But anyway, you know, the book of Ruth, I've written 2 books now on the book of Ruth, and I still haven't written everything that is coming out of that book. It is just powerful, and it went off like a bomb in my life. And that doesn't sound like the book of Ruth we typically hear about. But I finally saw her in true perspective. He started talking about what scholars were saying about that book. You know, I told you I was born into a family where there was just a very strong belief about a woman's role. And I was taught that I was not a leader, that I was born to follow. You will follow your husband, which I thought was a really great warning shot to hear, because I thought, I'm not into U-turns here, so I want to know where he's going. But what happened for me, to get the message that men are the ones who are responsible and men are the ones who are the leaders, led me to what I call a steady passivity, of learning to hold back, of learning not to speak up, learning, to look at men one way and women another. And Ruth, that day that he taught on that was an eye-opener for me and a total paradigm shift. There were just sobering implications for me, and that was before I learned anything about the Ezer. At that moment, there was a realization that God expects a lot of me, and I never knew He expected so much. And what happened to me at that point is that I grieved. I was devastated when I heard what He was saying about Ruth. That there was so much more I should have done with opportunities that I had. That I still grieve over that. I wasn't a teenager when I heard this. And there's probably no one that we would look to in the Bible less likely to give us an example of the Ezer warrior role model than Ruth the Moabitess. But I can't think of a better example than she is. But I need to set the stage for looking at her story, because traditional interpretations of the book of Ruth have thrown us off the potency of this story. We look at Naomi as this bitter, complaining woman, and that her suffering it has a utilitarian purpose in the book of Ruth because it sets us up for this meeting between Ruth and Boaz in the barley field. And it's she's beautiful, right? It doesn't say that in the text, but Ruth is beautiful, trust me. And he is handsome, and he's rich, and their eyes lock, right? And we hear this beautiful story of how they fall in love, and she proposes marriage. I have never heard a sermon on women proposing marriage, but she did, and he accepted, and they get married, and she gives birth to a beautiful baby boy, and suddenly this is what we're looking at. And I was always bothered by the happily ever after, because when you suffer losses like these two women suffered, you go to your grave as someone who is grieving. And so one of the things that I've been learning as I've been studying the scriptures is always to remind myself when I open the Bible that I'm not reading an American book. That as an American, I am as foreign to the world of the Bible as you can possibly get in today's world. And we need a heavy dose of humility when we study the Bible, because it's not, it's a culture that is foreign from us. And, for whatever you say about immigration, it is a good thing to be around people who are from countries that are more like the world of the Bible, because we can learn from them. Like I learned from my Tanzanian friend things I didn't know. And we can learn from them information about that culture that will help us understand our Bibles better. And, so we need help. We need help from them. The Bible is more like today's Middle East, or places in Africa or India, places where the focus is on the men. Patriarchy, this father rule, and it's about the patriarch in the family, and he needs sons to carry on to the next generation, and it's a matter of survival of the family and the stature of the family and the community. You need sons in patriarchal cultures, and a woman's value is derived from her relationships with men. It's like, who is her father, or who is her husband, but especially how many sons does she have. You gauge a woman's value by counting her sons. So according to that standard of measurement, both Naomi and Ruth are zeros. And Naomi is postmenopausal, and Ruth has been married for 10 years without a pregnancy, and she is certifiably barren. Okay, so she's lacking the number one criteria on eHarmony in Bethlehem that a man's gonna look for a wife. He's not gonna marry a barren woman, because he has to have sons. He has to have sons. And in that culture, widowhood is an utter calamity, especially if you don't have sons. I saw a news event where it was in Afghanistan, and they were bringing in supplies because there was a famine in that area, and the widows were being shoved aside. Everybody got what they wanted, and the widows were last. And that's the way that culture works. So we have three main characters in the book of Ruth, and we have Naomi, the Israelite woman who becomes a famine refugee, which sort of is, a beginning of the trauma that she experiences. We look at her as a bitter, complaining woman, but she is a tragic figure in the story. She has suffered catastrophic losses. She's just gone through a litany of losses, and for her, time is running out. She's going home to die in the story. She has no future. She's an older woman, and as I said, she's postmenopausal, so she's not going to get a second chance. And the first 5 verses of the book of Ruth unravel her story. And the killer verse in the story is the 5th verse, where it says, Naomi was left without her husband, without her 2 sons and her husband. And what I learned from Bruce Walke is that when you pick up the book of Ruth and start to read, you are reading the story of a female Job. That her losses are utterly catastrophic. That it's worse for her than it was for Job, because he can start again and she cannot begin again. And she's become, as I said, a famine refugee. She fled with her husband and their 2 sons to Moab, which is today's Jordan. And they were there for a long time, over 10 years. But while they're there, her husband dies. Her sons marry 2 pagan girls, which is not an Israelite believing woman's dream for her family. And they go through 10 years of double infertility. In patriarchal cultures today, widows are most at risk for abuse, poverty, trafficking, exploitation. Widows in India speak for Naomi when they say, this is not life. We all died the day our husbands died. So, back to this idea of when we look at Scripture, I've come to the conclusion, and I think my work bears this out, that patriarchy is not the Bible's message. It's the backdrop to the Bible's message. And it makes the gospel potency of that message stand out more strongly than it would if it took place, say, in our culture. Because the extremities in that culture, and frankly, patriarchy is as damaging to men as it is to women. I mean, there are very few men at the top, and there are a lot of men at the bottom in a patriarchal system, and even in our own culture. And it's a whole different story, and I've done work on that because I think it's important to look at what men are facing. But anyway, so when you look at the story against this backdrop of patriarchy, suddenly she emerges as a truly tragic figure. and she enters the dark night of the soul. She believes that she has lost God's hesed. It's a Hebrew word. We don't have any English equivalents for it. It's a brand of love that is voluntary. It is relentless. It is stubborn. It is sacrificial. It is the bedrock of God's people. And she thinks she's lost it. I mean, look at the evidence in her story. She says, the Lord has gone out against me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. It's the biggest loss of all that she suffered because she believes she's lost God too. I mean, why would he even be interested in her? So she's a zero, culturally speaking. She will live in the margins. She faces poverty and all kinds of difficulties and marginalization. And we need her story. We all need her story because sooner or later each of us is going to be sitting next to Naomi wondering where God went. So she's the first character, and it is her story. The questions that she raises in the beginning are the questions being addressed in the book. Has God forgotten his hesed for Naomi and her family? And God won't answer through a prophet or a priest or a voice from heaven or a bolt of lightning. He's going to answer her question through Ruth. Okay, the second major character in the book of Ruth is Boaz. Boaz is a very tall figure in this story. For my money, he's the best man in the whole Old Testament. I can't say enough about him. But when we meet him, all we know is that he's a man of enormous stature, a Mantle, which could mean he was a military hero. I've awarded him the Israeli Medal of Honor. But he's a man of power and privilege. He's male in a patriarchal world. He's born to one of Israel's leading families. His grandfather was the leader of the tribe of Judah under Moses. So he descends, it's like being a Kennedy or, when coming from a family that's, empowered to lead, expected to lead. And he holds all the cards. He has power, wealth, and pedigree, and he is in impeccable compliance with Mosaic law. He colors inside the lines. Ruth will teach him how to color outside the lines. But he is, he is a tall and imposing figure. She doesn't know who he is when she meets him. We all think we picture this dreamy scenario, but all he represents to her is that he owns this field that she is in, and he is a very powerful figure. So it could pose a threat to this undocumented immigrant who's come from Jordan. She's Arab. In today's world, she's a brand new convert to the faith. She's poor. So, her resume is all wrong in that culture. She's female, she's a Gentile, she's young, she's poor, she's marginalized, she's barren, and she can't hide that fact that she's a widow, but none of that will matter to her now. And God will work through Ruth to change the lives of Naomi and Boaz. She comes at a time when Bethlehem is in famine recovery. I always like to say that Boaz is working to make Bethlehem great again. They've gone through a prolonged famine, and so every little bit of grain matters. Okay, so let's talk about her as the Ezer in this story. Naomi's an Ezer too, but for the moment, let's focus on Ruth. Fortunately, I have a photo of her. So the first thing that the Ezer does is she embraces her image bearer identity. Her conversion on the road from Jordan to Bethlehem is a pivotal moment for Ruth. It is a moment that changes everything for her. The girl who arrives in Bethlehem is not the same girl as the one who left Moab. Culture, demographics, and biology define her. She stands on the lowest rung of the social ladder, and her expectations for her are lowered more so than ever. She is marginalized and she is silenced by her culture. Under patriarchy, women are denied voice, agency, and legal rights. So she's utterly powerless. But she will shed these identities for her true identity. Not biology, not gender, not demographics, not circumstances. Yahweh defines who she is. She is his child. She is a foreigner, she is a Moabitess, but now she is a citizen of his kingdom. When she's asked to identify herself in the dark of night, when she approaches Boaz, she says, I am Ruth. She's barren, she's written off, but she is responsible to contribute. She is an image bearer. There's no male to speak or act on her behalf, no male to defend her if she runs into trouble. But she's an Ezer. She knows she has a place and a voice, and she will speak for herself. I don't know if she thought through it like that, but that's how she lived. So how does she embrace her identity? The Ezer is intentional. She puts effort into knowing her Creator. She pays attention to what's happening around her, and she's intentional in how she lives. She has plenty of reasons to be afraid, to hang back, to keep her head down. But something more powerful than fear grips her. A daughter of Eve has come home, and she has taken shelter under Yahweh's wing. She will strive to live courageously as his child on his earth. So she embraces that identity, and that changes everything for her. She is a different person. But she is also a courageous advocate for others. I think this is really important for us to understand about the whole vision that God has given to us, is that it's others-centered. It's not about me, my, I. It's about what's happening to others and what can I do to make a difference there. And she has vowed to care for Naomi, and that vow will drive all of her actions. Their situation is dire. Hunger is waiting at the door when they return to Bethlehem. There are battles to fight. There's the battle of hunger, but also the fact that the family is dying out, for they have no sons to carry on the family into another generation. And that is an utter calamity in the patriarchal world. It's something we can't understand from our point of view, but it is utterly devastating in that culture. And the battles that she has in front of her will require radical proposals to a powerful man. She will have to be bold. She will have to move out of her comfort zone. But God will work through Ruth to change the lives of Naomi and Boaz. What happens in the ancient system is that there's a gleaning law that provides for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. And Ruth falls under almost all of those categories. And the way this worked was that a landowner like Boaz was allowed to harvest his field, but he was required to leave the edges and the corners for the poor, the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. So this is how it worked. He would hire harvesters, male and female harvesters, And the men would cut down all the grain, and the women would come up along behind, and they would bundle up the grain, and then it would be carted off to the threshing floor to be winnowed and, separated from the grain from the chaff. And as soon as they cleared the field, then the gleaners were allowed to come along and pick up whatever was left. It's very interesting that the law doesn't say how wide an edge is, or how big a corner is, or how thoroughly you should clear your field. It just said, leave the edges in the corner and don't go back to pick up what you missed. So I love that because it's sort of an interesting conflict of interest for the landowner. How's he going to do this? Well, we can romanticize gleaning all we want, but it's not very lucrative. There are people who glean in garbage dumps looking for anything that's left over. In our culture, it'd be like digging through a garbage can outside McDonald's and looking for the leftovers of somebody's Big Mac or some fries or something. But, it's a hand-to-mouth existence. And she doesn't want to take home scraps to her mother-in-law. And so, and the other thing we need to say is that, this wasn't a safe place for her. Boaz had to speak to his men and tell them to leave her alone when she ventures into territory that's off limits to gleaners. So, she could have been badly mistreated. She could have been raped in the field, and who knows what other gleaners might do who would be stronger than she would be. So, and she's a foreigner. She talks funny, and that sets her up for abuse as well. So, what she does is she makes, in both times she approaches him, and I'm really just going to talk about what happens in the barley field, but both times she is making radical proposals to somebody who is in perfect compliance with Mosaic law. There's no reason to be critical of him at all. And it is absolutely unthinkable that he would learn from her, much less listen to her. Look at the disparity between them. It couldn't be worse. And it's also unthinkable that she wouldn't keep her head down, and that instead that she's going to stick her neck out and open her mouth with this powerhouse of a man. She's on his turf. She's a novice to the faith. What does she know? And she's a widow and an outsider, a non-contributor. She's nothing. She's a zero. But that's not how she sees herself. And the same fierce determination that she exhibited when her mother-in-law tried to send her back to Moab, and she dug in her heels and used her voice and used her agency to say, I'm going with you, and she embraced Naomi and Naomi's people and Naomi's God. It's a conversion moment that completely changes her. And so she challenges Boaz's interpretation to Mosaic law. Ruth lives on the hungry side of the law, and the law reads differently from that vantage point. The letter of the law says, let them glean. The spirit of the law says, feed them. Poses a healthy conflict of interest to him, especially after what he's been through with the famine. But the law of God calls God's people to sacrifice for one another. And Boaz learns through Ruth that there are infinite possibilities of obedience to God. So she's not asking for permission to glean, as the law allows. She wants to glean among the freshly cut barley that's lying on the ground. And Boaz gets what she's trying to do. because it's all about Hesed for her mother-in-law. And he sees that. And this is a man of enormous power and privilege who gives us a completely different redemptive view of manpower and privilege. Because he doesn't give it up, he doesn't surrender it, he employs it. He employs it to empower Ruth to feed her mother-in-law. And he issues all these executive orders, to allow her to glean where she wants to glean, and he feeds her more than she can eat, and he tells the men to leave her alone, and he gives her access to water that the men have drawn. At the end of the day, he invites her to come back and keep gleaning where she'll be safe and where she can get more. And at the end of the day, Naomi is in for the surprise of her life. Can you imagine what she was thinking as she waited for her foreign daughter-in-law out there among the people of Bethlehem? What is happening to her? How is she being treated? What am I going to face when she comes in the door? What an awful day Naomi would have had, especially given her state of mind. But God is going to answer Naomi through Ruth. He answers Naomi when she's on the road from Moab to Bethlehem, feeling forsaken and forgotten and abandoned by God. She's being held in a human embrace and hearing words of fierce covenant love spoken to her by her daughter. Stop asking me to leave you. I will never leave you. When she's waiting there in the house, depressed and fearing the worst, Ruth doesn't bring home bruises and tears and an account of rape. She walks in the door lugging 29 pounds of winnowed barley. Is the mother a male harvester working the same amount of time that she worked that day would take home a 15th to a 30th of what she brought home. She brought home a half month to a full month pay for a male harvester in one day. And this is the turning point for Naomi. This is when Naomi realizes he has not stopped showing his hesed to the living and to the dead. It is a turning point in her story. It is when Naomi comes out of herself and we see a different Naomi in the next chapter as she starts thinking outward about Ruth and what she can do to take care of her, because Ruth will, given the way things normally work out, outlive Naomi and be stranded in a foreign country. So, the Ezer embraces her image-bearer identity. She is a courageous advocate for others, and she is a kingdom builder. She becomes God's agent in this story, a catalyst for change, where Hesed spreads like wildfire. It goes from Ruth to Boaz to his harvesters. They all participate in fueling Ruth's efforts to take care of Naomi. And it spreads to Naomi, where she begins to be a Hesed giver too. Sacrifices abound. Every person in this story is making sacrifices. The poor are fed. A widow is cared for. Her faith in God revives. A family is rescued from extinction. And God's kingdom touches down in the barley field of Bethlehem. And his purposes for the world move forward. I love that about their story. They never knew what God was doing. They never knew
that his purposes were being advanced by what this young girl started and what she and Boaz were doing. And Naomi will end up raising this little child on the theology she learned in the school of suffering. And we see that theology in David's writings when he says, surely goodness and hesed will follow me all the days of my life. Well, guess where that came from? I'm betting on Naomi. So, the Ezer frames all of our stories as women, and her mantle belongs to us. My jaw drops every time I ponder the book of Ruth, and there isn't a day that goes by that I don't remember. This Ezer's bold, rule-breaking leadership casts a bigger picture for me and inspires and challenges me every day. But you know, in a broken world, things are never that simple. I don't know about you, but I don't wake up every morning with a fire in my blood that I'm an Ezer and I have battles to fight. Sometimes I wake up with a knot in my stomach, wondering how I got in over my head in so many ways. Yeah, there's a lot of fear in the story of Naomi and Ruth, and I can relate to that. Paralyzing fear of trouble, of death, and loss, and of many things that actually come true. Of being alone, of being forsaken by God, of being pushed out of comfort zones and in over their heads, of what people might think or say or criticize, of facing a difficult conversation with a larger-than-life man. Fear can stop me in my tracks, can take the wind out of my sails, can cause me to take the safe way out, cause me to back up and hold back when God is calling me to step out. Sometimes the very first battle an Ezer must fight is the battle of herself. Several years ago, I had an opportunity to make a difference for a lot of women, and fear was in my way. And I had two options. I could take the safe way out, or I could do the thing that was terrifying to me. And no one would ever know that I made the easy choice. Or I could do the hard thing, and I could advocate for others. I could open up a conversation that needed to be open. But I could pay a price if I did. It was unfamiliar territory for me. It was in front of a lot of people. And I was leaning toward the safe zone. And then I had a conversation with another Ezer. I have to say, I'm never going to talk to her again. And I don't recall the details at all. I don't remember exactly what she said, but I remember at one point she said, God's hand is on us, and we have to move forward, even if we have to do it alone. And after that, I knew what I had to do. It's easy to hear a message like this and feel overwhelmed with the strong picture it paints and the fears we all feel. Any football player will tell you that it's not a badge of honor at the end of the game to be wearing a clean uniform. And I don't want to stand before Jesus in a clean uniform. We do have battles to fight. God's kingdom is at stake, and He has anointed us, all of us, to engage that battle for the good of His world and for the good of people. When I stand before Jesus, I may not have all the issues resolved in my mind, but I'd rather be explaining why I did too much than why I did too little. So let me leave you with a call to courage, and I think men need to hear this too, frankly. But the Bible has a lot to say about fear. and it is usually fear not. So listen to these words and take them to heart. Fear not was the message Jesus sent his first recruit, and the young teenager Mary, like Peter, James, and John, gave up everything to follow him and serve his cause. Fear not came through loud and clear to Mary of Bethany when Jesus silenced her critics and defended her choice to sit at his feet and learn right along with the men. And when the biggest news ever was breaking over this planet, the news of Jesus' resurrection, the angels said, "Fear not," to the women who were the first to hear and the first to take the gospel good news to their brothers. And Boaz said, "Fear not," to Ruth, and did everything in his power to promote her righteous cause and to fuel her answer to God's call on her life. Fear not.
Reflecting on, you said something that you said in the talk that we heard a couple years ago at She Leads, and it struck me again because and it means something to me personally, because as a seminary student and a woman who said kind of on this one side of like, okay, then I'm gonna do this, right, and I'm gonna have a role. And I had this picture of what that was going to look like in ministry. And then that got stripped from me unexpectedly. And then I stepped into, at the time, I was pregnant with our son. And I felt this sense of like, oh, like, okay, this calling that I had is gone. You know, and what do I do with that? And who am I? And then I heard you speak and you said, what you said today is that David says, surely goodness and hesed will follow me. And you said, where did that come from? And that brought such affirmation and spoke something out in me that said, I am an Ezer because that's who I am, no matter where I am and in what role. And that this is an expansive picture. It's not just for women who want to be in a staff in a particular role, and it's not just for moms. It's not just for wives. It's not just for us in this Western culture. It's for everyone. And so thank you. I was touched again by that as someone who has a lot of questions about what is next for me, and yet what is in front of me is a 22-month-old who I get to speak about God's hesed love, and maybe. Not maybe, but that will have an impact for future generations. Thank you. Thanks for letting me say that. What's stirring in you? What questions do you have? And thoughts? Anything you want to share with Carolyn and hear from her?
What you just said made me just immediately think about how many of the male Bible heroes had mothers who experienced long periods of barrenness before they gave birth, and just that God chose those women to raise even those sons because of what they had experienced. And so I just had to throw that out.
One thing I've never thought about before was how she brought up the point about how Naomi was female version of Job. I've never thought of it that way, ever. And so, but Job could continue on. He could find another wife. He could have more kids. But Naomi couldn't do that. And so that kind of, when she said that, I was like, wow, that's actually really true. And I'm really excited to like read the story more and get really in depth about that. So, and compare the two. So.
Let me just add too that there are women in the Bible who have contributed in powerful ways to our Christian theology. We don't give them credit. Like Hagar is the one who teaches us the intimate side of God. That, you know, Abraham needed to learn that. And, you know, you have Hannah, who went through those years of barrenness, and what, and I learned this from Bruce Walkie too, they're calling Hannah the theologian of the monarchy because she raised Samuel. And the theology that she is in her psalm shows up in David's words at the end of 2 Samuel. So, you know, it's sort of amazing, you know, how this all plays out. But, you know, it changes the whole book of Ruth to look at it as Naomi's story, and that she is this Job sufferer. Yeah.
I think we should think about them. Maybe there were a lot of Ezers in Bethlehem. It's interesting to me that it said that the women were excited when they came, and that seems rather odd, that the women in Bethlehem would have been excited to have these two foreign widows show up, and that there was a good report spread about Ruth, which was probably spread by the women, and then in the 4th chapter, it was the women who named Obed. I mean, I think maybe we should study Bethlehem. There must have been a lot of Ezer influence going on there.
A lot of big things happen in Bethlehem, that's for sure.
What other questions do you have for Carolyn?
I'd just love to hear more stories about how you're just unlocking the world to women. Because you have to everywhere you go.
I have more books.
I have to put a plug in for Maelstrom that I just finished. Amazing. If everyone in this room needs to read it immediately.
You know, we asked Carolyn at a dinner last night, some of the interesting places that God has taken me with this message. So we might share a little bit about El Salvador for one, Hong Kong.
I went, last year I went to El Salvador, and they were surprised that I came. And I said, well, I was actually more concerned about Zika than I was the violence. But the violence is horrible, just about everybody in that group. It was a large group, had a story of some close call they had or some family member who had been killed. And it's like, it's a femicide in the country. They're really going after women. And so anyway, that was I was able to go there. Some of my books have been translated into Spanish. And so, yeah, it was amazing to get an invitation there. And another group that was really fun was in Hong Kong. And it's a church that's right there in the city, in this big skyscraper. They have three floors in the skyscraper. And the gal who's leading the women's in that church is just amazing. She's become a really good friend thanks to Skype. But anyway, all the women who came to this were wearing lanyards that said, "I'm an Ezer," and and I still have mine. They passed out these little stickers that turn into tattoos, and it said Ezer, little gold Ezer stickers on their arms. And when the conference was over, the men in the church prepared a celebration, kind of a feast for the women. They did all the cooking and everything themselves, and they were all wearing white T-shirts that said "Blessed Alliance" on them. So anyway, yeah, you just never know where you're going to end up in all of this.
That's so great.
You had a question back there, yeah.
I suspect you're preaching to the choir today, and the question becomes, what do we do about this? What's the next step? How do you, in an organized fashion, bring down the preaching that says there is complementarianism? How do you teach the exegesis in a widespread way among God's church that, in fact, egalitarianism is what God meant for us?
Well, I have not joined in the debate on purpose because I think there are deeper questions we need to be asking. You know, because the same message is going to go to women who are never going to know a tiny taste of equality in their culture. But the gospel can go there. A woman can live out the gospel under a burqa. But, you know, she'll lose her life if she decides she doesn't have to wear that anymore. She can do, you know. So it's very dodgy to take it. You know, this is a global message, and the gospel is subversive, and it can go everywhere. And what we're seeing in this whole Church 2 crisis is that there are problems on both sides with how women are being treated. I'm guessing you know what I'm talking about.
No.
You know, that there are complementarian churches and egalitarian churches where the sexual abuse and harassment of women is happening, and it's happening in by some of the biggest name leaders. So, you know, and I run into women on both sides of the fence, and they tell me that things are not right where they are. So I think sometimes it's more about choosing sides than it is about asking gospel questions about our relationships. And so I want to stress that. And, you know, I've ministered in groups that were staunchly complementarian or staunchly egalitarian, and I think this takes us to a new way of talking, to a different place. I think, to be sure, equality is established on page 1 of the Bible. When God creates male and female as his image bearers. There's no ranking. And, you know, you have to do backflips or something to add that to the story. And what I wrote in Maelstrom, which was, you know, again, my books sort of grabbed me by the neck and take me somewhere I didn't expect to go. And Maelstrom did that too, because as I studied what was happening to women and girls, I realized that men are in big trouble too. I mean, you can lose who you are as a man if you lose your job, or you lose your health, or you lose your marriage, or you lose your, all sorts of things can threaten a man's sense of being a man. And they need the same kind of anchor that I've been talking about for women, that is indestructible. And, you know, I think that, you know, when I studied half the sky about what's happening to women and girls, and we get really upset about the statistics. Over 70% of women and girls who are trafficked in today's world. Well, that means, you know, 30% men and boys being trafficked for sex, for forced labor, to be soldiers. It's horrible. And I asked a friend of mine who works for the Census Bureau, I said, give me a picture of what that is. And she came back and said, that's roughly the population of New York City. So it's calamity. And then I learned that the men in El Salvador, this was true of them, these gangs that are there that are perpetrating this horrible violence. And this article said that the men who join ISIS are looking for meaning, identity, purpose, and a sense of belonging. And I thought, where are we in this conversation? You know? So it's not just, you know, I think it's much more complicated than the debate that we're kind of locked into in the church. And I think we need to ask deeper questions. We need to be more honest about our own vulnerability. And why we need a rock to stand on, and we all do.
What are a few of those questions that we should be asking, those deeper questions that you're referring to?
I think what I've been talking about is, you know, I have responsibility for what's happening in God's world. So what's happening where I am, and who needs encouragement, and who needs help, and who, you know, what job needs to be done. You know, it's about throwing ourselves into life, and it's about Jesus, you know, his example, what mattered to him, how did he treat people, who made him angry, you know, what kinds of things were offensive to him, and you know, how are we looking like him in what we're doing? But I think, let me add this, there's not a formula for this. And I think Paul nailed it when he said, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. You know, God is at work in you. And so we're going to make mistakes, we're going to fall short, we're going to miss opportunities, but by God's grace, we're going to move forward. And we're going to make tough decisions. And we're going to make a difference. And maybe we, like Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, will never know that we made a difference.
So sometimes when I talk to people who are skeptical about Christianity, they'll point to various things like, oh, the treatment of women, and I'll say, well, wait, no, you know, I'm learning all these great new things, and they'll say, well, that sounds great, but why wasn't God clear and, you know, right from the get-go? Why didn't he say right from the, I mean, of course we have Genesis 1 and 2, but in the rest of the Bible, like Jesus could have said it more explicitly. Why didn't they make it more explicit? Why didn't they say right away, no more of this, no more of that? Why wasn't God clear about, you know, the equality of men and women?
Well, I can't answer for God. But it seems to me that it's left us in a position where we've got work to do. And it's not, you know, we're not going to get, the Bible isn't a how-to book. It's stories, and it's, you know, people who are struggling, people who are angry, people who are suffering, and, you know, it's like we are. And so I think we have to work. You know, we have to work at it. It means for us to work at it. And, you know, even giving a law, like any law, you know, love your neighbor as yourself. When are you going to say, okay, I did that, now what? You know, it's like this. And I love that about it, because I think, you know, it's God saying, there it all is, you know, what are you going to do? And, yeah. So, and I think when somebody says, well, the way women are being treated in the church, it's true that it's wrong. And I think we need to face that.
Yeah, would you talk a minute about your study passivity? Because I think as a man, if I read the book of Ruth behaves like a guy would do. You know, I'll take care of this person, I'll go do this work there. But that obviously didn't occur to you until tonight.
Well, I think, and the women can chime in on this, but in the church, the operative messages for us are silence and submission. That's what we hear. And, you know, so we're sort of thinking it's this that you're thinking. Like for me, you know, I'm thinking when I'm growing up that I'm going to build my life around my husband, and that he's going to be the one with the story, and I'm going to be the support staff for him. And I'm not thinking, when we were first married, this is what my husband said to me. It was news to me. That he said, you need to find out what your gifts are and what God wants you to do with your life. And I'm not the answer to that question. So, you know, but it was the beginning of, and he's been very huge force in all of this. I always tell him, you are not the man of my dreams. I could never have dreamed you up. Because he, you know, he just has pushed me. And because, you know, just being, we get socialized. Just like men get socialized that they're not supposed to cry. You know, they're not supposed to show those kinds of weak, tender emotions. You know, and we have Jesus sobbing in our Bibles, but, you know, we socialize little boys when they get hurt that you're a big boy and you don't cry. And women get socialized to submit, to back off, and, you know, for some of us it's not always the easiest thing. We heard your story yesterday, Chris. You know, but we have to rein ourselves in. And so when you get good at that, then when you're faced with something where you need to step up, it's a battle, you know, to hear your own voice.
One more, and
Well,
then.
I don't know if this is a question, I was kind of processing, but I hear, like, it seems like we're talking a lot about men, women, marriage, this and that, but, you know, the majority of our culture now is divorce. The majority of our culture is single. I'm a 55-year-old single woman in the church. The church doesn't really speak to the single, and that's the majority of our culture this day. And so, this blessed alliance, pastors need to get with it.
Come on now.
They're speaking to married couples. They're not speaking to the single that exists out there in our culture.
But it's not about exclusively about marriage.
But that's what's being spoken
That's
in
what
the
is
church.
being spoken.
And they're not speaking into the life of the majority of what's going on in our culture. The greatest number of singles now is between 35 and 55.
No, I agree with you. I think that, you know, that's, for me, growing up, when I was in those 10 years of being single, I just felt like they're not talking to me.
Yeah.
You know, and the other piece of it is, we don't talk to people who are in the workplace about that they're doing kingdom work when they're out in the workplace. You know, not just because they witness or just because they come back with a paycheck that'll help the church, but because the work they do is part of that commissioning in the very beginning. The whole world is part of what God is calling us to do. So yeah, I think we've got bigger thinking to do, but you're totally right.
I make one comment to that too. I think, but I think too, like what you were talking, in my mind, how it ties together, is we're all the priesthood of believers. And so it's not just the pastor's job to speak truth. We all should know the word. We all have to be equipped with it. I can say just as well as the pastor, hey, this is what the word says. You need to live in righteousness, or you need to be an ambassador of Christ to your job. Like, I can say that equally from the side of friend and the pastor of being important. And so for it to all be on the pastor to say what the gospel is, it's never meant to be that. We're all meant to be about the gospel. We're all meant to speak the gospel. And by that, it's to be built up in churches in the church.
Well, I want to say thank you guys for engaging the conversation at this level, and in a room full of strangers for a lot of you. They're great questions, and the conversation and the dialogue that I think is helpful and needed as well. So we're going to get to keep doing that. So thank you guys. We're going to transition just again. The questions Rachel asked: what questions should we be asking? Great question. To help you with that, that's part of what these reflection exercises are for you to stop and take a little bit and just personally think through those questions and how to maybe look at things a little bit differently. So again, I'm just going to play.
Okay, home stretch. Yeah, I still don't know what you're talking about.
We're gonna have to pick some corn for you. We'll show you.
I'm a city girl. I'm sure that God answered your prayer. Okay. All right, so this final presentation is called Here Comes the Bride. One of the things that's interesting to me about brides is the obsession over the dress. And, you know, we just had another royal wedding several weeks ago, and that was all the talk about the dress. There was another girl who, on her wedding day, which we're told is the biggest day in a girl's life, the only thought consuming her was how to set fire to her wedding dress. The bride, the arsonist, was a 12-year-old Yemeni girl, Reem al-Numeri. Her father had arranged for her to marry her 30-year-old cousin. When she resisted, her father gagged and bound her. Her so-called husband beat and raped her to consummate the marriage. Remarkably, this young girl fought back. Several suicide attempts brought the attention of a judge who granted her a divorce. And now she's an activist to prevent child marriages in Myanmar. Another young girl, and both of these girls are written about in Half the Sky. It was by Nicholas Kristoff and Cheryl Dunn. Some of you have read that book. You all need to read it. It's an eye-opener. But Mina is Muslim, and she never got to be a bride because she was sold to a brothel at the age of 8 or 9. She was so resistant that they beat, drugged, and raped her into submission. She got pregnant twice. They took away her children to form the next generation of prostitutes, but she refused to give up. In Half the Sky, they write, her distinguishing characteristic is obstinacy. She can be dogged and mulish. She breaches the pattern of femininity in rural India by talking back and fighting back. Eventually, she freed herself and was reunited with her children, but it took time. Her son helped her free his sister, and some said of him that he had inherited his mother's incomprehension of surrender. We've been talking about God's story, God's vision for his daughters, how in the opening lines of the Bible, we are given leading roles. We talked about being God's image bearers, being Ezer warriors alongside our brothers, and that we are called to a blessed alliance of God's male and female image bearers. But the question that we face, and it's already come up in the discussion, is how do we move forward? How do we put together this with what happens next in our own stories? How do we live as image bearers? How do we live as Ezer warriors in the 21st century world? How do we build that blessed alliance? What is God asking of us today in the 21st century? And what is our message for women worldwide? If Reem and Mina crossed over from Islam into Christianity, would we feel the need to tame the fight in them? Would we give them quiet and gentle training? How would our focus on purity impact them? Or would we hold them up to our daughters as Ezer warrior role models and tell our sons to date girls with those kinds of qualities? In the gospel, God puts in front of us a vast, uncharted territory of limitless possibilities for what it means to live for him. There's a lot to what Paul said when he called us to continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. As I said, we don't have a formula for this. There aren't 6 steps or 10 steps to moving forward in this. We have to work at it. And a problem confronts us in the very beginning. And this is how I like to describe it. But when we open the Bible, we see God in spectacular creative mode. And he is creating this beautiful world, and he's calling his male and female image bearers to tackle this task that he puts before them. And he teaches us that we need each other, and that we're called to be a blessed alliance for his purposes in every venue in life. But before we see a single moment of unfallen image-bearing living, an enemy invades. And God's image-bearers revolt. And instead of seeing this picture of how this works and how this is lived out, we end up in the ruins of a fallen world. We end up looking for clues in the rubble of the broken world that God created. And here's the problem. Jesus calls us to advance a kingdom that is not of this world. Not a kinder, gentler way of doing things the way the world does, but a completely foreign, other way of living in God's world. It's a way we haven't seen. It's a terrible darkness that we live in. And we are called to advance this kingdom that is not of this world. The gospel calls us to a different, foreign way of living. And if our reference points are off, if we're looking at what we see in the world and trying to create that as our starting point, then our conclusions are going to be off. In the Bible, we get glimpses of a powerful lineup of bold Ezers. We have Naomi and Ruth, Esther, all the Marys, Huldah, and Deborah. We can witness in the Bible powerful kingdom alliances with extraordinary men like Boaz, Mordecai, Joseph, Barak, and Paul, not to mention Jesus himself. All of these people are role models for us, not just for leader types, not just for women who aspire to leadership or feel and know that they are gifted for that, but for all of God's image bearers. The Bible has a big definition of leader. It is what it means to be an image bearer. When I started to write the book, Half the Church, what my goal was in doing that was to put in a single volume what I had been learning and writing about in 3 previous books. People would ask me and I'd say, well, it's chapter 9 of the first book and it's chapter 1 of the second book, and it runs all through the book that I wrote about Ruth, the Gospel of Ruth. But I wanted to be able to say, read this book, and it's all in this book. But one of the things that I wanted to do when I wrote Half the Church was I wanted to explore 2 women in the Bible who are ideals, to find out what they would show us. And both of these women are brides. An ancient bride and a future bride, an Old Testament bride and a New Testament bride. And both of them command the biblical spotlight. The first is the magnificent grand finale of rich teachings on wisdom in the Old Testament. And the second stands in a blaze of glory in the final 2 chapters of the Bible. And both of these ideals help us fill in that missing chapter. They teach us how to live in the rest of the broken story that we are in. The first bride appears in Proverbs 31 in a conversation between a mother and her son. And her son is learning from his mother what to look for in a wife. It's counter-cultural eHarmony criteria in his bride search. It's not your mother's Proverbs 31. It's a passage that is often trivialized. We do this with a lot of biblical stories. We've Americanized it, but it's not a women's passage in the Bible. It's intended for all of us. In this conversation, I have a little history here. I get mad in a minute. So in the ancient Near East, the praise that shows up in literature that was written at that time is preoccupied when it comes to women with their physical and erotic charms and with their ability to produce sons. But King Lemuel's mother debunks all of that. She debunks physical beauty as praiseworthy, and instead she celebrates the activity of this woman in her family, in her community, and in her business. There's no counting of her sons, although we're told that her children rise up and bless her. They give her praise. When you look at what some of the commentaries say about this, they say this text belongs in Israel's heroic literature. It's the type of poetry is heroic, characterized by recounting a hero's mighty deeds that are usually military exploits. She is portrayed as diligent, a take-charge woman. She's engaged in profit-making ventures. She's a wise teacher, and she's a philanthropist. There's military imagery all through this text, and we don't see it in the English, but she's introduced as a woman hayal, and they usually translate it of excellence or virtue, but it's the same word that's used for Boaz, and it's a military word. And it is a very strong, she's a woman of valor, is basically what's being said about her. She is a spiritual heir of Israel's ancient heroes, and she is a champion of those around her by her diligent employ of wisdom. It says a lot about her hands and her arms, the strength of her actions. She works with her glad palms. She spreads her hands out to the poor. She holds out her hands to the needy. Extol her for the fruit of her hands, and let her work praise her in the gates. So she is demonstrating for believers what it looks like to live as a person who fears the Lord. Like a warrior, she girds her loins with strength and strengthens her arms for the task. She incarnates wisdom. She illustrates the teachings of Proverbs. She's praised for exhibiting concrete, practical wisdom rooted in the fear of the Lord. And she is a role model for all of God's people, not just for women. She takes us back to Eden, and she gives us what Eve never had the chance to do. She's described as rare and a treasure. She is precious because she uses her strength, ability, wisdom, and valor so totally selflessly for others. She is a gift from God. She is a woman of strength and action, a wisdom lived out in ever-widening circles, from her family to her business to her employees to the poor. She's a wage earner. She's a breadwinner. And it was really interesting to me as I studied her to realize that in some of the commentaries, they were a bit worried about the Proverbs 31 man. I mean, what's left for him to do when she's doing all of this? And is he left in the dust? Is he feminized or emasculated? How do we talk about this like it's a zero-sum game? You know, the whole idea that this is a teeter-totter dynamic is a fallen notion, because both of them flourish. There is a blessed alliance here between a husband and a wife. He trusts her. His well-being stands or falls on her reliability. He elevates her to the highest level of spiritual and physical competence. And this implies in the text that there is a robust spiritual relationship between the two of them. The Proverbs 31 man stands taller because of her, because he has such a wife. It says that they're singing her praises in the city gate. That is the place of government. That's the center of the community, and that's where they are praising her. Both of them are empowered to do more. because of the other. And just as an aside, I was, after learning all of this and thinking about my own marriage, and my husband and I were at a church service where there were about, it was a big church, about 50 couples who were renewing their vows. And it was quite amazing. And I turned to my husband and I said, I am never gonna renew my vows. Because I said, I would promise a whole lot more than what I promised on our wedding day. You know, I would promise to be his best friend. I would promise to be with him in whatever we had to face in life. I would promise to be his sounding board and his biggest encourager. And I would promise, that I would be in his way if he started to get full of himself or to head down, a path that was dishonoring to the Lord. That's what I should promise on my wedding day. And instead, what it seems we're doing is minimizing the significance of the commitment to another human being. We should make that same promise to our kids, to our brothers and sisters in Christ. This is what we should be to one another. And anyway, it's not too late. I still want to be all of that to him. And I want him to flourish, and I want him to succeed. And I get back from him more than I ever imagined a man would invest in my story. It's amazing. But let me tell you a story about him. My husband and I live in different time zones. He goes to bed early and gets up early, and I go to bed late and get up later. And he says, everyone who gets up early wins. That's right. And when I got married, I always thought that there would be these romantic New Year's Eve celebrations with my husband. He can't make it past 10. So I think it was the big one, when we were changing centuries and millenniums. And my daughter and I were gonna stay up till the ball dropped. And she had, this is when we taught him a lesson, actually. But she had this program on the computer that was Vogue magazine did it, where you could take a picture of yourself and you could put different hairstyles, try out different hairstyles. So we were doing that, and we were having a lot of fun. And then we came across one of his pictures. So we made him look like Elvis, and we made him look like a Beatle. And then we found the wedding veils. Yeah, so we tried those on him. And then the bedroom door opened, and out he came to find out what the ruckus was about. It was at his expense. But anyway, yeah, he still goes to bed early and gets up early. But he's a little been rebuked about saying you win when you get up early. But the thing that's interesting to me about bride number 2 is that this bride includes men. A pastor in the Northwest, he's not there anymore, but he objected to this, calling him a bride or part of a bride. He said, not me, that's bizarre. But this bride is made up of every tribe and nation. So there's no escaping it. This time when we talk about a woman, because this is a female image, men are on the inside looking out instead of on the outside looking in to this conversation. And whatever we say about this bride also applies to our brothers. And the implications are earth-shaking. I think it's amazing that when we talk about masculinity and what it means to be a man, or what it means to be a woman, that this bride gets left out of the discussion. It may this may explain why, but you know what? She is Jesus' Ezer. And the question we have to ask ourselves as the body of Christ is, what kind of Ezer does Jesus want? Like the Proverbs 31 bride, this bride is also countercultural, especially in the days in which the Bible was written. This bride, like the Proverbs 31 bride, is valued and prized. Jesus died for her. Contrast that with the stories that are in Half the Sky that I've just talked about. Military language is used for her. She is called to action. Not military harshness, not militancy, but a call to take back territory that the enemy has seized. And the enemy is not flesh and blood. We fight on behalf of flesh and blood. She's called to battle by the Apostle Paul, and he calls her to be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. She is called to put on the whole armor of God so that you can stand against the devil's schemes. She shows up in two places of the book of Revelation. The first time she shows up as a praying bride. She's realistic about the world and the power of evil in it. And she prays for God's kingdom to come. We read that another angel who had a golden censer came and stood at the altar. The smoke of the incense, together with the prayers of the saints, went up before God from the angel's hand. Jesus is her North Star. He is her source of guidance and power. The stakes are at their highest. Jesus has called us to a battle where kingdoms are in collision. There is unspeakable suffering in the world that God loves. And she is called to join Jesus' rescue operation. That whole battle throws us to our knees, and we become a blessed alliance with Jesus when we start right here. We align ourselves with him when we pray, your kingdom come. But this bride does more than pray. We read, "For the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear." And then we read, "Fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints." This is really big. And when I was studying this, I nearly fell off my chair. Scholars completely miss it. They squirm not about being called a bride, but in giving the bride too much credit. They qualify in their commentary what is being said. Elsewhere in the Bible, we are told that we are clothed in the righteousness of Christ. But that is not what is being said here. Righteous acts get reduced to personal piety and moral purity, and while those things are important, they are not what is pictured here. This isn't Esther who's being presented to the king after marinating in oils and perfumes for an endless months of beauty treatments in the harem spa. Righteous deeds, the dress given her to wear, is made up of her righteous deeds, of her acts of justice, of action she takes setting things right in God's world. She is a true Ezer warrior, and she is attired in a beautiful wedding dress that is made up of her righteous deeds, of her works of justice. This Ezer has been in the battle. She is an activist. Jesus doesn't do everything for us while we just sit on our hands. We are called to work to bring God's gracious kingdom to earth, to notice what is wrong around us in God's world, and to do what we can to change that. We're not called just to go to church, just to read our Bibles, just to be spiritually minded people. We are called to engage in the rescue operation that Jesus launched to get his world back the way he wants it. Jesus wants a full partner in that battle. A partner who shares his vision for the world and works to bring God's gracious kingdom to earth. Professor Gordon Fee writes that we are not merely passive recipients of what Jesus has done, but that the righteousness of the bride of God's people here in this final glorious scene is visible to all. The bride's righteous deeds are put on display. The angel says to John, "Come and see the bride." I think the words in Proverbs 31 are appropriate for this bride, that she should be extolled for the fruit of her hands. Resistance to this idea is completely amazing to me. In the first edition of my book, on page 189, if you have a first edition copy, please edit it. At the bottom, I wrote, "The bride is reason to celebrate." And some editor changed it to "The bride has reason to celebrate." The message that's conveyed by these brides' righteous deeds completely revolutionize our views of women and girls, of brides and wives, of the body of Christ and his bride, and catches us all up short. His bride is a proactive participant. She has embraced Jesus' vision and has thrown herself, heart and soul, into his cause. The Lamb occupies center stage, but his bride is being celebrated too. She is being celebrated for her deeds of justice in God's world. And I have to believe that Jesus smiles over her. "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." This climactic vision of the Bible invites us to picture ourselves standing on the top level of the rostrum, having won Olympic gold, making an acceptance speech after winning the Oscar, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize. These images are not the gateways to retirement, but the gateway to even greater opportunities and achievement. God's great story begins and ends with a vision. Image bearers flourishing, creating, leading, ruling, subduing. Ezer warriors giving their all. A blessed alliance, a strong and powerful and beautiful force for God's purposes in the world, living in solidarity together. The ending gives us a picture of a glorious, achieving bride, the return of the King, the destruction of evil, of darkness, and of the enemy. We live in the war-torn, broken in between. This is where we live, where these kinds of things are happening in God's world, where God's image bearers are being abused, their lives are being destroyed, potential that God invested in them is being utterly wasted. The offenses against these vulnerable ones are intensely greater because they bear God's image. And assaults against them are assaults against Him. I don't know about you, but I want my prayers to be some of that smoke that is rising up to heaven. I want my deeds to add some pure white linen threads to that dress. Earth is emitting a distress signal. The cries of the oppressed and the forgotten around the world, in Missouri, are falling on our ears, the ears of God's representatives, the ears of those who are called and created to speak and act on His behalf. We have more information, more wealth, more resources than any previous generation. How are our stories going to read in God's greater story? Jesus' gospel opens up a world of possibilities for what it means to live in this world as God's image bearers. He frees and empowers us to embrace our lives and to engage the challenges, crises, and opportunities that are before us. Our image bearer identity means that we are not spectators in God's world, that we are participants in the solution, that as leaders we have responsibility to call other men and women to join us in engaging this all-important battle. Our calling as women, as Ezer warriors, should draw us out with the same stubborn, fierce determination that we see in Reem Alimeri and Nina. God's vision is of a blessed alliance, the oneness of His gloriously diverse people, the church, His bride. I want to end with a prayer that Lynn Hybels wrote that she called the Dangerous Woman Creed. But I want to read it for all of us. And with that, I want to end. Dear God, please make us dangerous men and women. May we be people who acknowledge our power to change and grow and be radically alive for God. May we be healers of wounds and righters of wrongs. May we weep for those who weep and speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. May we cherish children, embrace the elderly, and empower the poor. May we pray deeply and teach wisely. May we be strong and gentle leaders. May we sing songs of joy and talk down fear. May we never hesitate to let passion push us, conviction compel us, and righteous anger to energize us. May we strike fear into all that is unjust and evil in the world. May we dismantle abusive systems and silence lies with truth. May we shine like stars in a darkened generation. May we overflow with goodness in the name of God and by the power of Jesus. And in that name and by that power, may we change the world. Dear God, please make us dangerous. Amen.
We are going to change up the end of your agenda just a little bit, and I kind of want to bring everything full circle. We're going to do our reflection exercise first, and take about 10 to 15 minutes to do that. And then we'll bring Carolyn back up here for one final chance for you guys to ask any questions you want of her, of us. And then we're going to conclude with one of the favorite things that Rod has modeled here at TEI, which is a chance to share back to her as a guest of ours and be able to talk a little bit about just maybe what the content meant to us, something that we're going to get the chance to take home, or something we're thinking about, so that she leaves with part of that, part of what God is doing in us, and we can hear and share that together. So we just want to encourage you to stay kind of in that place of what God is saying to you through what she just spoke about, as well as what's in the reflection exercise. And when the music's done, we'll come back up and bring Carolyn any questions. I think my response would be that we have no specific agenda. This is not about what you were hoping to get out of this. It would be that you get out of it, have gotten out of it whatever God has for you to do. And that really is the hope. And I think that's probably going to be different for everybody in every different chair. I think in terms of the questions that I maybe hope we're asking as we leave today, they would be things like, God, how have you created me in your image? And what would it look like to live out of that image-bearing identity? And if you are female, God, what are you asking me to do with this Ezer identity that you've given me? And what would that look like to live that out in my world? And for the men in the room, what identity, what does that look like for you? And who are those Ezers in your life that you can help empower? And the last one would be, what blessed alliances has God put in your path? That maybe you had never thought about it that way. That may be a first step in whatever it is He has planned for your life, your world, your church, wherever it is that He has you, your workplace. And what would that look like? So those would be my hopes as we leave today. So we want to give you one final chance to ask any last questions you have for Carolyn. You can make them really tough if you want. So you come back up here, Carolyn. Maybe not so tough. It is the end of the day, and she has spoken 3 times. But yeah, any last questions? You can also incorporate in that if you want to, just a little bit maybe about what God has done or something that you're taking away. Yeah.
I think in the church right now, and we've had this for so long, is there's so much opposition to this idea that men and women can be equals and that we can have an equal say in what happens. And there's so much, when you bring up the discussion, so much anger that comes out with that. And I think in our tradition, like the church in the past has always held this tradition that it's men and women underneath them, and that women need to be quiet and need to not have a say, and that their contribution needs to only come from what the men have taught them. How have we missed something like this equality that can be so beautiful? How have we missed that for hundreds of years? I just don't understand how we haven't gotten to see that yet.
I think we do see it in places in Scripture. We see it in different, even situations in our own stories. But we live in a fallen world, and we dream deeply of that fall. And it's easy to just try to nuance the way the world does things and think that that's what Jesus wants from us, and when it's a whole lot more. And I think we're all in this together in terms of striving to realize more of that. I don't have an answer for settling the tension that's in the church. I think that has to be a work of God, and I think we can be part of that by how we not fight, but how we live out hesed in the body of Christ, that we display love for our brothers. And and I've run into it too. I even run into the problem, when I'm not in the church, that there's still opposition to the kinds of things I'm saying, because there are party lines that both sides are looking to hear. And, I think the challenge is to each one of us to try to be the difference. And like I said, I don't have answers for what's wrong, and we're finding in that church 2 crisis that the problem is worse than we thought. That there are really deep problems that we have, in our heads. So yeah, I think you can be part of making a difference. You can be a friend. I think most guys can point to a friendship with a female that meant a lot to them at some point on their journey. And pastors need encouragement. They get all the criticism, but it means a lot when somebody says, I'm praying for you, or your ministry matters, or there are things we can do to break down some of the barriers. Yes.
Not in terms of particularity like my wife and I, but in the big scheme of things. What is it that women with the perspective we talked about today need from their brothers?
Well, I'll tell you that, when men are affirming, when men use their power and privilege to open doors, or to encourage, not everybody is interested in a door opening in the church for them. Some of them are in business or in other occupations. But to have a man show interest in who a woman is and what she's doing, where God has called her, and to speak into that with encouragement. We don't have many of those conversations in the church. And when I had jobs where I was in the secular business world, nobody ever asked me what I was doing. If I went on a missions trip, it was a big deal, but other kinds of work didn't really matter. But I was with a group of women, and there were probably over 300 of them, and they were all women in ministry or wanting to be in ministry. And I said to them, how many of you are doing what you're doing because a man was a mentor or opened a door or encouraged you? And almost every man. And that was a mixed group. There were egalitarians and complementarians there, but it was it's the same story. So I think male privilege and power are such extraordinary gifts to men. They can be used in life-changing ways. Like Boaz did for Ruth. He had a lot of power, and he pushed it to the max to get what she wanted from you. And I think that redeems what male power and privilege is portrayed as. And we need more of that, and all the men are good. It's not just the pastors, but it's all of you.
And an additional one, I think, is to speak to other men clearly. If you see something, say something. Now, that's not a helpful way to say what you need to say or to do what you need to do. You walk back and do that differently. To be that role model for other men is huge.
Well, what's curious even about Karen's additional comments is we are reflecting on some levels of power as physicality. And I know, our friend Sarah Sumner, who mentored us early on about this subject, would talk about how much she needed the elders in her church, for instance, to make a way for those who might resist her. Or she would put it, any group of men can beat up any group of women, and therefore men have to take that physicality power that seems to be inherent within the creation itself, and as you said, to defend and to speak up. Not that women cannot also be physical, but something about paving that way or standing against abuse. Would you
Well, I
Thoughts
think,
on that?
and men are, I think some men are doing amazing things on that. Helen, tell about the men and what they're doing that you were telling me about online and stuff.
So one of the things, just generally within the anti-trafficking movement that we're trying to emphasise is the importance of talking about demand, not just the women and the traffickers, but what is driving the demand, because without the demand, ultimately there wouldn't be a supply. And so aggressively looking at that, but empowering men to be part of that as well. And so there's this amazing group that we're partnered with in Portland, and last year I trained 40 guys, so in Kansas City we have a group from multiple different churches doing this. And it's a men's only outreach group that on the down low put fake ads on the internet for women for sex. And so they're getting sex buyers, calling the phone off the hook. And what they do is they answer the phone. A lot of the guys immediately hang up because there's a man on the end of the phone. But for the percentage that do stay on the line, they talk them through and explain, we're not just buying sexual services. The majority of women in prostitution are forced. There's a third-party presence of a pimp. There's coercion. They're the most vulnerable women in societies. Have you considered any of these elements? Are you aware that soliciting prostitution is actually illegal? I could have been a cop. You could have been arrested. Meanwhile, their friend is looking up their number. Sometimes it comes up to a business website or a Facebook page. So they may screenshot a photo of their family while they're on the phone to them and say, think about what's really worth it. Or just getting the message of, we're watching you, take this seriously, see this as a wake-up call, and at the end of the phone call they offer them services for sex addiction. And it is a small percentage that accept that, but it's still more men than if there were no calls at all. And I can guarantee that many of those men, they have the database of the numbers. Many of those numbers never ever call back again. And what I think is that for some of them that was a wake-up call of their deviant, secret, broken habit, completely enshrined in addiction and brokenness, and men need liberation from captivity. It looks different to the women, but it's very real. And it was a light shined on that dark habit that shook them up out of this secret identity that they'd created. So we've actually just started doing in-person outreaches. I started that just a couple of months ago, of not only calling them but setting up a fake date at a hotel. The guy shows up expecting a woman, and it's a couple of our guys who confront them. The first time we ever did this, the guy stayed an hour and a half, fully repented, received prayer, was like asking for so much counsel. He was a young American guy. We were in Russia for the World Cup when this happened, and he just, anyway, so in this whole conversation, I'm loving seeing men step up and saying, okay, it's men that are the problem. 99% of all buyers in sex trafficking are men. So they're taking responsibility, saying, well, how can we be part of the solution? How can we bring about positive masculinity? I'm actually speaking at a conference in a month that's all about how men can rise up and help change the culture in this crisis of violence against women. So I'm seeing, this is the first conference of this nature that I've been at, and I'm so excited hearing everything that you've shared, and I'm also excited thinking, I know that in other pockets of the church and community, men are also talking about how do we bring liberation for men from a toxic masculinity into all that God's called us to be in this expression of bringing healing and reconciliation to gender. So anyway, that was a bit of a long explanation, but if you can't tell, I'm excited about what's happening.
And it proves the point that men are a huge part of the solution in a lot of different ways.
I just wanted to say that I feel like you just charted this brilliant, amazing spirit-led force to create common ground between polarized groups in the church. And I'm just so excited about that. You mentioned speaking to this group of women that were both egalitarian and complementarian, and can you just talk more about how people on both sides have been able to see a future here, I guess?
I think the gospel needs to distinguish us from the rest of the world, and that we need to move to a holy level of relating to one another as men and women, as a family, as brothers and sisters. And I felt when I first started watching the debate, and I was very interested in it, reading all kinds of things, that it wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't, there wasn't a resolution. It's just sort of, it has become, for women, it's become a litmus test, if you're safe or if you're not safe. And I don't take those tests because nobody's safe, I'm not safe. We need to think about what I've said, and I'm not perfect and I don't have a corner on anything. So, but I just, I think we need to look more at what is Jesus' gospel. It is a very big gospel. It is a gospel that means to make very big changes in us. It's not going to make us be a nice group of people. It's going to make us radically different from the way the rest of the world thinks. And you run into that around the world. There are different situations where, and maybe it's something horrible that's, driving them to say, we don't have time for all this other stuff. We've got a huge crisis here on our hands, and we have the luxury of debating and telling some people you can't do this or you can't do that. But all of us, men and women, hear things that we can't do because of our gender, and we have a huge mission on our hands, and there are not enough of us to do the job. We need everybody. It's an all hands on deck, and we need to be calling each other out. Pastors can't do it all, and we are so wrong to put it all on them. We have to be a body. 4 years ago, I was diagnosed with lung cancer, and to this day, I still feel that where the surgery was. My body tells me every day how important it is for your body to be fully healthy. And I'm fine, but I'm just saying, you want your body to be a healthy body. You don't even like it if you have a bad hair day or a broken fingernail or something. Jesus wants a healthy, fully functioning body. And, we shouldn't think any differently about his body than we think about our own body. And that means little kids will be called into this with us. Little kids can be amazing little warriors for Jesus and, make a difference where they are. There's so many stories in the Bible that are little kids, young teenagers, and, so it's an all-in kind of thing. And, think what it would be like for somebody from the outside to walk in and feel like, wow, what have you brought for us, and how much is God going to do through you with us, and what are the gifts that you just delivered,
How is God using this journey in your books to bring people to Christ, and has it opened doors for people to see Jesus for the first time?
You don't know because you're not out there where they're reading, but I do know that it's having an impact on, and it's doing some waking up of Christians.
Have you experienced in your study or come across women who have bought in or supported this skewed perspective of the Blessed Alliance, or any reaction to your books, female resistance to this idea?
Yes.
And what's your reaction to that?
Well, I think what I'm talking against are some very strongly held views. And one of the things that I think we all run into, and I've run into it too, is that when, we talk about quiet time with the Bible, but the Bible is intended to disquiet us. And what you find in the Bible is that you come across things where you think, oh my goodness, I'm 40 years old or I'm 50 years old, and I got that really wrong, and some people just can't do that. I mean, what did Abraham have to do when God called him when he was 70? He had to think differently. He had to look back on 70 years with regret because he wasn't walking with God then. And I look back on my story and I think I've wasted opportunities. I've thought I've expected less of myself. And here in this country with all the possibilities that are in front of us, to be guilty of that kind of waste, I don't like to think about it. And I've had to rethink my whole life, and I'm still rethinking because I still come across things where I think, well, I didn't know that. We're learners. We're lifelong learners. That means change. And we don't want to change. We want to feel like we've mastered Christianity. We know what we're supposed to be and do. We're following the whatevers. And it's going to throw us out of that. And people don't want to be thrown out of that. I had ran into one woman who submitted to her husband. They had 2 children and she wanted a 3rd. And he said no. And, for her to say, I need to engage my husband, we need to have conversations, it's not just boom, for him to be able to do that. But for her to look back on that, and, it's hard to go over there and say that there should have been more discussion about that. There should have been more praying together about that. And instead of, okay, grit your teeth and submit. That's not really what submission is about. Anyway, but it means a whole big disappointment for her that she, to go back and look at that. It's a hard thing. It's a hard thing, and we've all got that. So, God help us to be willing to repent and for things we've said or taught people. So I think that gets in our way. That's a big thing, and we'd rather be right than sorry.
I was just wondering what your standpoint is on women having preaching jobs, so being the head of a church, because some people see it as a male should be doing that, a male should be head of the church, but then there are a few cases where I have seen a female who has led the church, and I was just wondering what you thought about that.
Well, it happens. And it's interesting in our day that, if a woman feels called to that, and she's in a denomination that prohibits it, she knows where she can go to pursue that. I don't want to tell anybody that God hasn't called them to do something. I don't know what God is calling people to do, and women always preached. They have, and when I went to seminary, I learned to look at the Bible through male eyes because all of my professors were men, and I reached a point where I had to look at the Bible as a woman, and I think we need that conversation to take place. I think women need to be in our seminaries. I think women need to be in the discussion about biblical teaching. I think in churches where they don't want women elders and they don't want women pastors, they still need to engage with women in their decisions and in their thinking. It's just the way it's supposed to be, and it turns out better when you can do that. There was an example, because I was in a church that would never allow women to be an elder, a deacon, or pastor. And since my marriage, we were in that church. And the deacons were helping this woman who was divorced, and she had financial problems, they invited one of my friends to meet with them. And the men were talking about the electric bill and the water bill and mowing the lawn, and my friend said, I think she's lonely. They just hadn't thought of it. And they set up different women to go have coffee with her, take her out to lunch, or go visit her. But it was just a richer picture, whether the things they were talking about needed to happen. And what she brought to the table just made their ministry to her richer. So I think it's a both and. And, we've got a mix in America of churches that will, have a female pastor and churches that won't. But that doesn't excuse the rest of us from stepping up and doing what God is calling us to do. That's, when you talk about women's ordination, and when I started my ministry, I knew that that is less than 1% Christian women. And that's mainly what we want to talk about when we talk about women in the church. And I wanted to talk about all of us. So I don't get into that. Because all of a sudden, I'm not talking to most of the women if I do. So. Did that make any sense? So I've been in ministry for about 30 years, and I've seen the whole gamut of being invited and being uninvited, simply for being a woman. And I've been in seminary, kind of whispered in your ear, being the only woman in my seminary class, and having my papers distributed among other pastors to, look what the chick wrote, And so I've experienced a lot of that, and so sitting here, my mind is swirling with a million questions that seem to fall short. I'm like, no, that's not what I want to ask. And I think it all goes back to what you started with about our identity in Christ, and knowing God, and being rooted and established first as women, really who we are, and to be satisfied with a rich gift that's been given to us, and that we are a part of something. And I think, for me, if I could be convinced that I was on purpose, and very intentional, by living God, and that I'm part of the bigger picture. In some ways I feel restless, but in other ways I feel patient with the process because of where it started, and that I have something that God has given me, but I didn't know I had until today, and to be a woman of God's Word, I think is one of the greatest gifts that we can be proud of as women, to have a grasp and a hand on the Word of God. Because I can be as vocal and passionate as I want and still be labeled with many words that are inappropriate, because women, if you're outspoken, often even in the Christian sectors, can be even labeled as immature, But for me to be established with the Word of God, and to be confident of that, and start with knowing Him, yes, it is very empowering for me, and very affirming to me, because God is sovereign. And to hear you speak today is revolutionizing to me, looking back and going, oh man, I wish you had spoken 30 years ago, when things started out with this truth, of who we are as women in the body, and that a really important role is being missed, because we were stirred. And we don't do that anymore. And I'm grieved and excited all at the same time, because I don't know, it feels like we're still handcuffed. I see you guys wearing keys, and it's like, who holds that key to women really being acknowledged? Say Ezer. But it goes even back to what Rob was saying, what we need from spiritual leadership. And I think sometimes even just that we see you. So we see the giftings that God has blessed you with, and it's welcome in the church. And you're invited into that with all your giftings. Your giftings are needed in the body of Christ beyond children's ministry. Because I'm not called to children's ministry. I'm called
discipleship and to teach, and to have a woman teach the word. Is that right? I don't know. As I'm processing out loud with you, there's a mix of questions and I'm like straight up in my flesh. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Get the blessing chair for you.
Yeah. Blessing chair. I got one here. Yeah, wondering what advice you have for raising daughters. Got a baby girl.
Yeah. Miriam and I were talking during the break. I have 2 little grand Ezers, and they're in Juneau, Alaska now. They've just moved there from Florida, so.
All right.
Climate change, big time. But anyway, we get pictures all the time on our phones of what they're doing, and my daughter sent a picture. You know those rock climbing walls? The 4-year-old was up at the top. You know, and I mean it was like at least 2 or 3. Oh, it's probably three stories up.
Wow.
You know, so I just think, you know, to encourage your daughters that being strong is a good thing, and that it can be good for others. All of this is other-centered, and that it's good to be strong, that it's good to use their voices, that they need to care about others. And, you know, I think the examples of young girls in the Bible, some of them are really extraordinary, and all the more extraordinary because against that patriarchal backdrop, it's totally unlikely that they would ever come up in the story. There's a series, I don't know how young your daughters. Baby? Okay. So there's a new book series that is just, they're coming up with their 4th volume for little girls, that it's about women in the Bible. And I'll have to send you the title of the series. Do you know what I'm talking about? I can't think of the title of the series. Called and Courageous is what it is. And anyway, so people are doing things too. And I was telling some of you that during one of the breaks that I met with a group of middle school girls who had just read through my book, Lost Women in the Bible. And I went and met with them. It was absolutely mind-boggling to see these young girls just fired up and, you know, excited about what God was going to do and was doing with them. And, you know, so yeah, I think it's important to start young, and, you know, that they don't make some of the mistakes some of us have made.
I would extend that question to voice.
Absolutely.
Yeah, talking about demand reduction, and thinking it goes so much further, you know, in our culture, how boys treat girls, and as they grow up, you know, that's gonna something stick with them. That's where you can, I think, the most practical application of all of this is how we treat and raise the children that we're around, whether they're our children or at church or if you work in schools.
Yeah, I mean, they're a front line for the church's ministries and for in the home. The home is a front line, you know, for the children. So it's really excellent asset. Anything else? Yes.
I listened to a man a couple years ago who came here to Columbia for a business meeting, and his name was Sean Askinozy, and he founded the Askinozy Chocolate Company down in Springfield, Missouri. And he has an incredible story of redemption, and I went to it for business purposes. But as I was listening to this man, I started to get more and more excited. Like, oh, this man's a believer, and I'm just sitting here in the seat. I'm just getting more and more excited about what he has done. Like you, taking that responsibility that God gave him to reach the world with what he could. And he had a phrase that just resonated with me because of my story. But he said, "Out of your deepest pain will come your deepest passion." And it just, I want to get this book. I haven't gotten it yet. wrote a book, and at one point in his story, he put a video, a really short video of these wonderful African American people just dancing for joy. And he said, you know what they're singing, aren't you? And then he showed a picture of where they lived. And they live in these huts, in these hovels, what we would call huts and hovels. And these people are dancing for joy. So they're praising God. And it was at this business meeting in Columbia. I was like, this is great, you know. These people know what's happening to them. But I would encourage everyone, if I might, to help you understand that what you are asking people to do is the same for men as it is for women. You're asking us to make a choice with the things in our lives, not just the things in our lives that God has gifted us with, but the things in our lives that are hard and the things in our lives that are pain. And I resonate with your pain. Like I heard it earlier in the presentation. Some of you know my personal story, and I'll step out on a limb here just for a second, but I come out of a story of the patriarchal church movement helped me to stay in an abusive marriage for 25 plus years and helped to foster a lie in my life to try to keep me from being who God wanted me to be. But in the process of becoming free from that, I had a pastor of a large church here in town, and I shared part of my story with him of how my husband threatened me with a gun to my face. He told me, if you really cared about your marriage, you could make it work. But God called me to remain in that church, and forgive that man, and listen to him grow, and say to thousands of people when the True False Film Festival came here in town, he said, I cannot believe how ignorant I was about domestic violence. To see that change happen and to hear God speaking to him and say to him, you're ignorant, you need to learn about what it's like to be forgiven. So out of our deepest pain will come our deepest passion, and I think that it's a choice that all of us are going to have to make and embrace those things in our lives that are so difficult that we think that we're the only ones. As women, we think we're the only ones, but we're not. Men have those pains too, and to embrace our brothers and to say, I'm called to forgive you, and we're called to work in this kingdom together. Because that's what God calls us to do. So I would ask the women in this room especially to see where you can make a difference and to choose to embrace. Because that's a lot of what it is, especially right now what we're feeling in the United States and across the world. We see that pain. We want to point fingers and not understand that men have pain for that too. It's a choice to forgive and work out of that with one another to make this a better place.
Stay optimistic. Yeah. It's a hard thing.
It is
to get
hard.
hit with the, you can make this work. But yeah, it's really important. Thank you.
Carolyn, have a seat. Oh, you don't get to teach like now. You can sit down. You can take a break. Carolyn has gifted us with her Ezer, her full self today, and so we want to return the gift and bless her and affirm her. And so I think we have time. Like we want to hear from as many people as possible. So, but let's do this quickly, fairly quickly, and just share something that God did to you today, or a way that you were encouraged or affirmed, and Rod will get us going.
I first read Sarah's book. I think it's the first time I heard a woman teach theology through her writings. And so I resonated a while ago when you said I was taught by men, but I couldn't see the Bible through a world of women. And so thank you for your commitment to scholarship and to writing, because when I read it, even if it's different for me, it's good for me. And I am growing in my capacity to be able to see that. Similarly, of course, we know that's true of hearing from Asians and Africans and South Americans. So that's a growing theological benefit that we have evangelically, but certainly, again, right here with the other half of the church. Thanks for working hard on your scholarship.
I really, really, really love that you like rightly divided the word. Like, and not according to my opinion, but according to what the words mean. Like that you took the time to speak to the time